Well, welcome everyone to our very first bioethics seminar, and we're really happy that you're here. I heard that St. Matthew's had one this past weekend, and we actually have more people in ours, so go Team Grace. We like to represent. All right, well, on behalf of Father Kirby and Team Grace, welcome to those who are visiting. Today is a really important day. We spend a lot of time researching all kinds of topics, how to get a good interest rate on our mortgage, what school to go to, all those things. But there are some really important topics that surpass those, and today we're covering one of those topics. And we're very blessed to have experts with us to help guide us through some very important decision making that we all may face at some point one day. So I would like to just briefly welcome Kathy Schmuggy from the Diocese of Charleston. She's not freelancing it. Kathy has a master's in bioethics, so we have a definite expert in our midst. Michael Aquilino will be joining us soon, another great expert from the diocese. And of course, our very own pastor.
This is what it looks like.
Father Kirby, who has incredible expertise, and we're just so blessed to have him pastorally. So we have a great lineup of information for you this morning. We'll be covering bioethics this morning, and then we'll break for lunch, and then in the afternoon, we'll be welcoming a representative from Heritage Funeral Home to assist me in talking about pre-planning for funerals. So not only the funeral liturgy, but also on the practical side as well. And I would say the liturgy is more practical and more important, but we want to cover all the topics for you. So with that, I would like to introduce Father Kirby, our pastor, again, to open in prayer. So thank you for being here today, and there will be a clipboard being passed around if you could just sign in.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord God, you are the King, the ruler of the living and the dead. We come together today in order to hear your wisdom, to once again understand what you ask of us, especially as we pass from this life to the next. We ask that you give us openness and docility of heart, that you give us strength to follow whatever you might ask of us, that we can understand with your Son the importance of redemptive suffering, and that we're willing to give you all that you ask. And we ask these and all good gifts through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
So good to be here with you. And I have to say that when I look at a room so full, I think of all the advocates in this room, and I'm thinking, praise be to God, because we need advocates. So although you might have come here thinking that you're coming for yourself or for a loved one, you are coming here for much more than that, because we need more advocates, and so that your work and even your experience with your loved one or even with your own self can be used to help others. And that's the key. Not to wallow in mistakes, and we will all make mistakes. Not wallow in unforgiveness. We all will have to be forgiven and forgive. But to move from that to a place where we can grace others. So today, the way we've structured the workshop is it's threefold. So it'll have three parts to it, and then, of course, it'll conclude with this fourth part that Natalie has put together on the planning of the liturgy and so on. The three parts that we will be handling is going to be starting with a theological background or basis on dying, on end of life. Then the next will be practical examples. So what I will try to do, and that's my part, Father will give the theological background. I will try to help you apply it to very specific and real cases. I changed some of the details just to protect the individual families, but that they're real stories. And having you all function as ethics boards or family in conversation over this particular patient or person. And then lastly, Michael Aquilano, when he gets here, he will go through the healthcare power of attorney, talk about some of the importance of doing that form and how to help you fill it out as well. So I am now going to leave the mic to Father to talk about the theological background.
Once again, good morning, and thank you for being here. So of all the places you could be on a Friday morning, you chose to be here. The Holy Spirit's called you here, and I'm very grateful. First, because you're such wonderful people. Secondly, because you all just look so wonderful and beautiful, okay? So, we're going to, excuse me?
And alive.
And alive, exactly. Yeah, that's good. Bravo, Kathy. All right. And this really is the time to be asking these questions because either it's Kathy in her role with the Family Life Office or in my role at times at the diocese that oftentimes if we don't have this conversation this way, then we have the conversation in a hospital hallway room or waiting room or on a phone when someone's in ICU or something's happening. So it's better to do it now so that when those moments come, there can be greater peace, and these decisions are already clarified. These decisions have already been made to the degree they can be. So I'm just very grateful that you're here. What I'd like to do is, first of all, this seminar that you're attending was actually written many years ago by Kathy, who was, of course, in the Family Life Office. You heard about her degree. I had returned from Rome with a degree myself in bioethics, then later went on for more studies. And then Michael, who has a law degree and has experience in terms of promoting our efforts at the State House here in South Carolina. So the three of us got together and said, we need to kind of figure this out. And at the time, we had a board of advisors of doctors and nurses who assisted us. We brought all this together because we thought we really need to begin to address these issues, at least provide people who are interested with some preventative knowledge, right, so that we can be ready. The Lord tells us the story that it's the wise virgins who prepare the oil, right? It's the unwise who get caught off guard, and then they cry and they're not ready for the bridegroom, right? We've found that more and more happening. We thought there's something we can do. So this seminar was actually written in order to offer that service. So believe it or not, we've actually been doing these seminars for several years now. I rotated off the team, and I'm back. Okay, all right, I told Kathy, I guess we're bringing the band back together, okay? So, all right, what I'd like to do in this first part, as Kathy said, was provide you with a theological background. First of all, when we come together as Christian disciples in order to ask these questions about death, dying, the dying process, ordinary, extraordinary means, we have to realize that we are approaching this as believers. So there's going to be a lot that I'm going to give to you that if you don't believe that, you're going to have problems, right? Because there are things that as Christians we approach in a far different way than the unbeliever. That's true in all areas of life, isn't it? The way we show mercy, the way we welcome children, the way we spend our money, the way we vote, that includes even the way we die, right? So if we're struggling with our faith, then I would say now's the time to get your faith together, right? Because it's not going to end. And when you get to the dying process and you don't have your faith together, these questions are 10 times harder than what they're supposed to be. And the answer that your faith is going to offer to you might be an answer that you have not prepared yourself well to receive, right? So I want to just stress right from the beginning, we're going to approach this as Christians. Right? So I'm not arguing with some state ethics board or some hospital. I'm going to present an argument of our teachings from the scriptures in the church to fellow believers. Right? So with that said, I want to take us right to Matthew chapter 19. It's a story that we heard recently from Mark, but I like Matthew's version better. So we know that the Lord, he traveled throughout Galilee in his ministry. We know he's constantly traveling, he's constantly preaching, and we're told throughout the scriptures that the crowds loved Jesus, right? They loved him because they got miracles, they saw signs, he was a powerful preacher. The crowds loved Jesus. But when it came time to listen to his message and to accept it and to follow him as disciples, we know that less than 100 people chose to do so. In fact, at the end of our Lord's earthly life, 3 years of ministry, he had his mother, 12 apostles, and 72 disciples. That was it. Why? Because the original listeners understood exactly what he was saying. Forgive my neighbor, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile. That one particularly burned. Remember, at the time of our Lord, the Holy Land was occupied by the Roman imperial authority. By Roman law, any soldier could command any subject of Rome to carry his armor. We're talking about almost 60 pounds. To carry his armor for up to 1 mile. It was humiliating. Imagine you're sitting there having dinner with your family and a Roman guard comes in, drags you out and says, here's my armor, and it's heavy. You've worked all day. And in front of your children, your grandchildren, you have to walk with this soldier who's maybe just, having a good old time, smoke a little tobacco. And you're carrying his armor for up to 1 mile. It's humiliating. It was exhausting, and it was a symbol, a sign of Roman occupation. The Lord says to his disciples, I want you not only to go 1 mile, I want you to go 1 more mile, 1 extra mile. And for many people who heard that, that was too much. It was too much what he was asking of them. So all these crowds who loved him so much, supposedly, when it came time to say yes, to accept the demands of discipleship, they said thanks, but no thanks. But what do we see in Matthew chapter 19? In the midst of the crowd, we are told that a young man steps out. First of all, bravo, right? He steps out of the crowd. Means he already realizes that there's something different being asked. This isn't just about signs and miracles. There's something else happening. He steps out of the crowd and he asks a question. And the first question he asks, one of two that we're going to pay attention to, good teacher, what must I do to have eternal life? If only every Christian believer would ask that question, right? Good teacher, what must I do to have eternal life? It's a desire for fulfillment, desire for eternal life, desire for divine fellowship. Good teacher, what must I do? Now, Jesus kind of jokes with the young man. He says, why do you call me good? There's only one who's good, God alone. Jesus is trying to reveal his divinity to the young man, but he's not getting it. So eventually the Lord just answers his question. You have heard the commands. Do not steal, do not commit adultery, honor your father and mother. It's as if the Lord's saying, you're not quite getting what I'm doing, but I'm going to just answer your question because it's a great question. What must I do to have eternal life? Obey the commandments. The young man comes back, he says, but I've done all this. Ding, 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 second question. What still do I lack? That's a powerful indication that this person's understanding the spiritual life, a powerful indication that he has actually been fulfilling the commandments. Because he realizes that the fulfillment of the commandments, it's leaving something uneasy. Something's not done. What still do I lack? Imagine the pleasure of the Lord Jesus as he realized this young man is actually beginning to get it. And the Lord says, go, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. Now, there are some people who think that this encounter is just about money. It certainly includes money for all of us. But more importantly, the Lord was going to exactly that thing, that one thing that the young man could hide behind, use to justify or manipulate the Lord's teachings. There are always competitions in our heart. Biblically, we call them idols. There's always competition. And for that young man, it happened to be money. And we're told that he went away sorrowful because he had a lot of possessions. He wasn't willing to let them go. Because for that man, with money, that was his God. That's where he felt control, comfort, stability, the things we're supposed to receive from the living God. And he wasn't willing to let it go. So he gave up. And he quit. He wasn't willing to accept the demands of discipleship. Remember the conclusion of our Lord. Follow me. That's an invitation. And that's what that entire encounter was about. Young man, you seem to be getting it. It's great. Follow me. But if you're going to follow me, this is what's required. The young man said, no way. No way. Too much. Sorry. Nope. Not going to do it. Now, why do I begin with that encounter when we're going to be discussing end-of-life care and end-of-life discernment? Because that experience of the rich young man is precisely the experience we go through whenever we have a dilemma in our discipleship, and in particular at the end of life. Because what is the one thing that our culture most values, our Western and our American culture most values? Autonomy. I will do it my way. I will do it this way, when I want, how I want, in whatever way I want. Huh? We pride that. We even think that's virtuous. Huh? What's the old song? Old Blue Eyes. Regrets, there were a few, but I did it. Yeah, Pope Francis says that's the theme song of hell. I did it my way. It doesn't matter if there were faults or regrets. It doesn't matter if I hurt people or if I was hurt. It doesn't matter if I caused harm to my relationship with God. It doesn't matter because I did it my way. Right? We value that. That is completely countercultural to the biblical mandate and the summons to discipleship. My way. What about God's way? It's the exact same struggle that the rich young man experienced. And we're approaching the end of life. We've heard so many times people say, well, I'm okay with the dying, but I am not going to be fed artificially. No matter what, I will not have that done to me. Okay. Well, then the Lord walks away. You walk away sad. Because the Lord has called you to something. Are you going to sacrifice your autonomy, or are you going to follow the Lord? The decision is just as simple as with the rich young man. And we have to decide for ourselves. So oftentimes what we can think is, well, I followed the Lord on all other matters, so now when I get to the end, it's okay to put a pause on my discipleship. As if it somehow ends because now we're suffering. Well, now it's getting real. Now I can actually be in suffering or in pain. Well, can I ask, well, what has your Christian discipleship meant your entire life? The whole point of our Christian discipleship is to be made fit for the kingdom of God. The whole point of our Christian discipleship, assuming we understand our faith, is to allow ourselves in the dying process to give even that to God so that we can share in the resurrection. And to get so far, and at the end of life to say, no, I will not do that. I will do it my way. What was all of that life of discipleship? Where's all that virtue and all that grace? To get to the end and say, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. It indicates that somewhere along the line there was either a lack of formation, a lack of cooperation with grace. Something's wrong. And we've seen it time and time again. As if people think that when I get to the dying process, then I've arrived and it's over. It's not over till 3 hours after we're dead, right? The Lord's going to continue to call us to follow him. And don't we understand that? Because what do we teach 7-year-olds? Oftentimes people are surprised when they first see the Hail Mary. Non-Catholics are surprised. Wait a minute, you teach this prayer to children? Holy Mother of God, pray for us now and at the hour of our death. That's right, from the time they are 7 years old and they learn the prayer, we are preparing Christians for a holy death. And that means when we get to the end, we have to realize that we are called to a certain way of life and to a certain way of dying. St. Paul says it best in the letter to the Romans. We think he's most likely speaking about martyrdom, but he says both in life and in death, we are the Lord's. We do not belong to ourselves. And I've oftentimes said to people, perhaps the last gift you can give to the Lord, the last gift we can give to the Lord in this life is our dying process. I don't want to do this, Lord, but I give this to you. Even my dying, I give to you. And the Christian disciples used to doing that. It's accustomed to doing that. I don't want to forget that person, but I will. I don't want to go the extra mile, but I will. I don't want to go to Sunday Mass, right? But I will. The disciple has trained herself or himself in this way of discipleship so that when the end comes, it's like, I don't want to die this way. I don't want to be fed this way. But I will. Because we've prepared ourselves. Because contrary to the rich young man, we have said yes. I will give up everything. I will give you my autonomy. I will give you my life. I will give you my preferences. I give you all that I am, Lord, even my dying process. Okay, with that understanding, we need to stress 3 principles that will help us as believers. First and foremost, we see that the first answer that the Lord gives the rich young man are the commandments. There is an objective order of right and wrong that surrounds us. It is wrong to kill someone. We know that as believers. There are objective standards. It's not as if because there's pain or suffering, somehow all the rules are lifted. Suddenly everything becomes subjective and it becomes simply what I want. No, there's an objective standard, and the Lord emphasized that in his first answer to the rich young man. What do I have to do to have eternal life? Obey the commandments. That means when we get to the end of life and we know, well, we could probably just do this or have our loved ones do that, and we can break the objective order. We can have someone take our own life. You'd be amazed how oftentimes euthanasia happens in hospitals. Just a little extra pain medicine, right? Or a little more neglect. It's actually easier than you think. And you don't even hear the stories about hospice care, some of them. So we know there's an objective order that we are called to obey, that no feeling, no emotion, no state of affair can justify the breaking of that objective order, that moral law. We are bound to it as believers. That's our first principle. We have boundaries. We didn't create them. We can't change them. We can't hide them. We can't legislate them. They are given to us. They are embedded in our human nature as the children of God. And as believers, we readily accept them. That's our first principle. Our second principle is we realize our dignity as the children of God. It means we have a vocation, a calling. Our first vocation is to be human beings. That's right. We have a vocation to be a human being. That means there's a certain way that we're called to live. We know that. When we're kind, we are more human than when we're cruel. We know that we are more human when we serve our neighbor than when we're selfish. We are called to be human, and to the degree that we respond to this human vocation, we flourish as human beings. This vocation relies on the moral law. We also know that because of our human vocation, there are certain things that we must always do. I can't walk into a hospital room and say, this person's dying, so you know what? We're not going to change their adult diaper. This person's dying, so why don't you go and shut off the air conditioner? They're going to die anyway. It doesn't matter. That would be cruel and a grave offense against the human vocation. Why? Because that person's still alive. That means there are certain things we do until the person dies. That means we give them heating and air to the degree that we can. It means we keep them comfortable. We change their adult diaper. It means we feed them. And we give them water, even if it's artificially administered. We don't starve people to death as Christians. And what's the distinction between the two? We know that as long as the body can assimilate food and water, it is to be given food and water. Until the degree the body cannot assimilate it anymore, or to the degree that it begins to cause harm to the person, it could be suspended. But only up until that point. This is very important for us because we don't see nutrition, hydration, even if artificially administered, we don't see it as medical care. We place that within the vocation of being a human being. That's just care. That's a basic human need. What would you think of a mother who starved her child to death? Well, that's oftentimes what people will do to their loved ones, and the doctors will say to them, it's okay, they're not in pain. That's a lie. The only reason why the person might not be in pain is because they're so doped up that they can't feel the pain. It is horribly cruel to starve someone to death. And if you were to take them off their meds, they would scream, I'm in horrible pain, right? You know? But we just medicate it. And we look and the person looks like they're in peace. They're only in peace because they're drugged. As Christians, we do not starve people to death. We don't suspend water. That's a basic human need. And for us as believers, that's a work of mercy. So we know that that second vocation stands out. We have a human vocation we are bound to as human beings, as the children of God, both in ourselves to respect and to respect in the lives of others. And there's a second part of that. Within our human vocation, we all know that we have a specific vocation. As believers, we know that God has given us a portion of his kingdom. He has said to this man and this woman, I give you this portion of my kingdom, your family. St. Paul tells us that every family receives its name from the heavens. It means every family is a domestic church. Every family is a part of God's kingdom. And God entrusts that kingdom to that man and that woman. Or to myself as priest, I entrust this parish to your care. That's what that ceremony on Monday where I was named pastor was all about. This portion of God's kingdom is now entrusted to this priest. Or this holy widow might be entrusted with this particular care of this particular group. Or this single person might be entrusted with the care of their adult parent. Whatever it might be, however it might be, we know there are specific vocations within our human vocation. It's very important in terms of moral discernment that we identify what these vocations are, because that's going to be a huge part of our moral discernment. So what is our vocation? So for many of you, it's marriage. For some of you, it's holy widowhood or widowerhood. Widowers, okay? For some, it might still be single. For myself, it's priest. That's very important. Our human vocation, our specific vocation. Here's why. We go to the third principle. Our third principle is whenever we approach a situation where there's a medical decision that has to be made and we are now engaging in moral discernment, the principal question we have to ask, is this ordinary or extraordinary? Extraordinary. Former terms would say proportionate or disproportionate. We actually don't like those terms anymore. Because once you start to speak about proportion, it sounds as if you're just weighing what's best, right? And sometimes what's best isn't what's moral. So we prefer the terms ordinary and extraordinary. Is this ordinary or extraordinary? Is this person still assimilating food, or is it causing harm? If it's causing harm, is that ordinary or extraordinary? Does this person need this particular medication, even though it'll break the bank, even though it may not work or has a 30% chance of working? And on and on and on. Whenever we're approaching the question, is it ordinary or extraordinary, and how do we decide that? We have to weigh some options. And before we weigh the options, I want to stress our first principle. There are boundaries given to us by our Creator that we are not permitted to violate. So with that understanding, that one first, we now begin to look at our human vocation, our specific vocation. We begin to look at all the factors that might be a part of this. And so we say if you have one case, you have one case. Because each one will be different. And someone could ask, well, wait a minute. Is it possible that the same medical procedure or treatment could be ordinary for one person and extraordinary for another? Yes. And the dean gave the example with the ventilator in the Sunday homily. If someone's in the older age and so on, and they need the ventilator to breathe, and that's the only thing that's keeping them alive, that's extraordinary. The ventilator can be stopped. But if we're dealing with a child, an infant whose lungs are still being developed and they just need a ventilator in order for the lungs to develop, that would be ordinary, right? So it's possible that the exact same medical procedure can be ordinary for one, but extraordinary for the other. What are the factors that go into that? First and foremost, we can't violate our human vocation. Secondly, that specific vocation, that comes into play. What are your gifts and talents? What are your obligations to others in the sense of a community life? So if you're married, you have obligations to your spouse. If you have children, you have obligations to them. Have you been entrusted with a specific mission that only you can perform in that place at that time? What is your level of pain? What is the procedure? What is the cost? What is the percentage of success? What are the possible side effects? All these factors are taken into consideration as we discern whether this is morally optional, extraordinary, or morally obligatory, which is ordinary. And that decision within the parameters of the first principle of the moral law is left to the conscience of the individual believer. But I don't say conscience like, oh, that means that she's on his own or he's on his own. They can decide whatever they want. No. Discernment is that we seek the will of God, not we decide it for ourselves. So that means that the believer has to be well-formed, has to understand church teaching, has to be able and willing, either themselves or through proxies, to speak to their doctors, to priests, themselves to look at what are our insurance rates, what is my level of pain, all these factors go into that. And that's why the church would allow that freedom of the individual believer to decide within the realms of the moral law what is ordinary and what is extraordinary. And once it's decided that something is ordinary, then the person is morally obliged to do it, regardless of what pain or suffering it may cause. Once it's decided whether something is extraordinary, it means it's optional. The person can still choose to pursue that treatment or that procedure, but they are not morally obliged to do it. Now, I want to clarify these terms because these are our terms, and the way that we approach these terms in our faith is much more holistic than your doctor or your nurse or your hospice care worker. For them, when they speak of ordinary, extraordinary, they are only speaking of the medical procedure. Let me give you an example. For the medical profession, when food and water is given by artificial means, for medicine, that's always extraordinary. That's not how we understand it. And incidentally, that's not how the medical community understood until the early 1990s when the insurance companies petitioned the court and had the courts declare it extraordinary. Why? Because now your insurance company doesn't have to pay for it or pay for it as long. So even the medical community, before the insurance companies got involved, they understood this isn't extraordinary care. The person just needs help eating. This person's fine. They'll be okay. They'll be able to heal as long as they're receiving this food or this nutrition. Or even if the person is dying, to say, yes, eventually this cancer or this disease might take their life, but it doesn't mean that we just begin to starve them to death because, they're going to die anyway. It'll put them out of their pain, put them out of their misery, right? These are terms we hear. I have oftentimes heard people say, Father, I just want to die with dignity. And I say, good news. I have good news for you. You will always die with dignity. No one, no thing, no legislative body, no person, not even ourselves, can take away our dignity. Our dignity is given to us. It's instilled in us in our very creation by God. We will all die with dignity. Then we also hear people say, well, I just don't want to be a burden to my children, and sometimes adult children, shame on them. Some of them make parents feel that way. Right? I don't want to be a burden to my children. Say, too late. Too late. You've been a burden to them since the day they were born. Okay, right? Right? People are not burdens, to clarify, beyond the joke. People are not burdens. Responsibility can be a burden. Yes, it's very burdensome to care for someone when they're ill. But that's the care, that's the burden, not the person, right? And we understand that when we love people, and we're called to love, and sometimes that means we die to ourselves, we're willing, we're eager even, to take up that burden of care. We also sometimes hear in our culture these expressions, the quality of life. Right? I once had a man reference that if he could not do the things that he wanted to do, like golf and all these things, that he didn't want to live anymore. I thought, what a selfish, egotistical, narrow-minded, lost soul. If you can't do what you want, like play golf, you don't want to live anymore? And that becomes our culture. It's all about quality of life. What can I get? What can I do? What powers do I have? That's not how we understand as believers. We always understand this within the context of our relationship with God and our relationship with our community. That's why our specific vocation is always taken into factors. What responsibilities do we have to others? To spouses, to children, to the community. That's always taken into account. So this notion of quality of life, well, we can be sympathetic. Certainly we want people to be comfortable. Certainly we want people to be as functional and engaged in life as possible. But when those things are taken away, and they will, as Christian believers, we're ready for that. As Christian believers, we understand, okay, now this is part of it. This is the part where, yes, there might be some pain and suffering, but this is part of it. It's not that, well, no, this is who I'm supposed to be, this quality of life, and because I don't have that, I can just end it. I think one of the grave things that we have lost in our culture that the scriptures give to us very clearly are the notion of phases of life. Read wisdom literature. It's great. It has this great wisdom for young people, great wisdom for people in their middle age, wisdom for older people, and so on. By the way, one of the greatest wisdom for older people in the scriptures is stop complaining. I might run that in our bulletin a few times, right? But the scriptures acknowledge phases of life. But our culture doesn't do that. Our culture tells us that we are all supposed to be as functioning and mobile and energetic as we are when we were 28 years old, right? Think about that. Our culture is constantly telling us that we're supposed to be what we're always supposed to be in our early middle age. That means we're always behind the power curve. We'll never have that energy. will never look that good, right? But we are constantly held to that standard, which means we constantly feel inadequate. We constantly feel insufficient. We constantly feel as if our quality of life has somehow lessened. But apply biblical wisdom. It's not that we've lost anything. We've just entered a new phase. In fact, the scriptures actually tell us that older age is a blessing. Very few people got there in biblical times. And for those who reached older age, they were praised for their wisdom because they were allowed to reflect on life. Some time ago, a grandfather said to me that the greatest blessing he never expected, but the greatest blessing he received, was watching his children become parents. He said one of the best hobbies he has now is I just sit and I watch. And he says, I'm constantly moved watching my children be parents, watching my grandchildren. He said, I get to watch that. That's the wisdom of older age. That's not anything insufficient. There's nothing deficient in that. It's not as if, well, yeah, okay, Grandpa's doing pretty well, but, he should be moving a little faster, Can he, hurry it up in the bathroom, Like, there's not, that is the wrong application here for the believer. This man has entered, or this woman has entered a new phase of life with new expectations, new blessings, a new aspect of her or his vocation. I think that if we step back and we understand the call that the Lord Jesus is giving to us throughout our life, especially in the dying process, we can understand these three principles. There's a moral law. We have a vocation, a calling as a human being, and specifically to follow God in terms of his kingdom. And we have the power to discern by faith and reason what is ordinary, extraordinary, and God gives us the grace to do what is ordinary. And there will be times, there's no Pollyanna here, there will be times when there's suffering. But for those of us who worship a crucified Lord, who have suffered for him throughout our lives, by our charity, by our mercy, that's no great surprise. And for none of us, would that be an overwhelming cross. We know that God's grace is sufficient, and he will ask us for many things. I'll conclude with this story. The principal of my high school, before I went to seminary, I taught high school. Before I left, he was very sick. It turns out he was diagnosed with a very terminal disease. And it should have taken his life. He should have probably had about 3 months of suffering and so on before he died. And I remember speaking to Mr. Theos, and he said to me, he was always a strong man. He's just a great, one of those larger than life figures, And he said to me, he says, I don't know if I'll have the strength to do this. His wife very quickly told him, shut up. He said, I'm not sure if I can do this. And we, of course, assured him, as I assure you, his grace is sufficient. We can trust God's providence. He will not ask us for more than what we are able to do. He will take us to the very limit, but he will not go beyond. Right? They were moving Mr. Theos from one care facility to another. And to this day, we've received no adequate explanation, but on his way in the ambulance, he suddenly died. He just died in the ambulance. They kept trying to resuscitate him. He's dead. They had no idea what happened. And I believe that God probably understood that servant would not have been able to endure that suffering. And so God called him home. If we cannot endure the suffering, God will call us home. We can trust in his providence as we have throughout our lives and in our discipleship. And if he does not take us home, then his grace is sufficient. And whatever he might ask of us, we can do. We just have to say yes. Thank you.
So, if I can get a hand, if you could raise your hand if you have any medical background, so I know who I have in my crowd to depend on. Good. Okay. And I also, if you could raise your hand, those who have been through a recent loss or have been in the hospital with a serious illness with someone, yourself or a loved one, raise your hand. Okay. I'd say in the last 5 years, but it depends on the person. But I'd say in the last 5 years. Okay. And that's good to know, because when we do these ethics, when we break up, and I really would actually like you to see it instead of an ethics board, because that does seem almost not very emotional, that you're a family or you're a family friend, and that you've been called in to be part of a consulting team. That's what we're going to do in this next activity. So all those great principles that Father laid out so beautifully, we will now try to apply them to real life situations. and you've now been called into this. And I want you to be aware that you're not just seeing a patient or a case, but a person, somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, somebody's son, grandfather. And that when we make these decisions, that the weight is not so much on quality of life, but the dignity of the life in front of us. And I have a motto that I really did see played out with my dad is make every breath count. At this very moment, but certainly at the end of life. I will start with a story. My dad had lived to 97, and I feel very blessed. Most people don't get to see that type of age in their family, grandparents or parents. And one thing that happened at the very end of his life, and there was a lot of near misses and a lot of ambulance driving, and I can tell you stories. My dad was a very healthy man, and that's how you lived in 97. And his last breath, he said the word "to." He was on the phone with my mom, who's 92, and she said, "Walter, don't leave me. Don't leave me. I love you." And he had just been taken off the ventilator. His throat was very hoarse, and his last words were "to," because he couldn't say "I love you too." He didn't have it, but his last words were "to." And I say this story only because this is serious business. This topic is very serious. Death in the dying process doesn't have to be chaos. It can be a time of reconciliation, and it can be a time of peace. The fact that you're in this room right now is that you're allowing it to be so because you're planning ahead. You're thinking about this ahead. And you can be the greatest advocates for those who are directly going through a situation. Because one thing that I saw very clear, I'd been doing these talks. It wasn't until I actually was living it through with someone that I absolutely adored with all my heart, my own father, that it became very real. And I can tell you that when you're very emotional, the science tells you your frontal lobe, the part where we make all our decision making and complex thinking, does have a hard time managing itself. So again, another reason why thinking through these things, talking about it, sharing your story is so vital, because when you're in real time, sleep deprived, emotionally charged, having to deal with different opinions and different emotions, you're not at your best thinking. So to have documents, to have stories back in your mind will help you make those decisions that are best and the ones that are easiest to reflect back on. So our first case, and I hope we'll be able to get through a few of them, is a case, and again, it's a real story, and it illustrates double effect. And that's one of those things that if you get this principle down, it can be applied to so many of the situations that you will see with yourself or with a family member who is dying or who is critically ill. And double effect has 4 criteria, and I'm going to read them to you straight out of the book, okay? If you would open your book, actually, you've been given this beautiful booklet. I do really encourage you to take the piece that Father just did and truly reflect on it before the Blessed Sacrament. That's your homework assignment, okay? Each and every one of you to reflect on that piece. You heard him speak, but hear those words, read those words before the Blessed Sacrament, and see what it is saying to you and how it applies to your life. Right after that should be my case scenarios, and that is, we're going to start the first one, but before you dive in, let me give you the principles that you're going to apply to this case, and that is double effect. And so the first is that the act that's done must be good, or at least neutral. So right off the bat, if the act that I want to do is killing somebody, and that's my intention, I can't do that if that's my intention, because it's an evil act. There's a commandment, the 5th commandment, thou shalt not kill. So we have to make sure that the act that is being done, that we're deciding whether to do or not, is good or at least neutral. And then we also have to say that the good that we're trying to achieve cannot be done through an evil means. And you've heard the means matter. It's not just the outcome. So even with all the compassion in my heart, I can't stand to see such and such suffer. We can't do that. And we can't do an evil act to prevent that suffering. So this is where Father was mentioning this starving and thirsting someone to death. I might hate seeing them suffer, but I'm not allowed to kill them and starve them to death as a way to stop that suffering. So you see, wanting to stop suffering or at least lessen suffering is a good. We all can acknowledge that. But I can't reach that good through an evil act. The evil must not be intended, and kind of speaking to that same, but only permitted. And then lastly, and this is important too, is that we have to weigh that act that we're going to do that may have some difficult consequences. And we've got to make sure that the good that we're going after is worth the ill effects that might come alongside this good act. So if I'm achieving or trying to do something good and there might be some negative effects, I have to weigh that and make sure that the good is higher than the bad effects that might incur. There's different things, like when you look at cancer treatment, and we're going to cure somebody with cancer, but we also know that chemotherapy could have some negative and not so great side effects. You weigh, okay, we might be able to help this person overcome their cancer or put it at rest, but in doing so, there's going to be some negatives, like the person might lose their hair. They might have some nerve damage, but we weigh that, do you see? And we have to make sure that the good that we're reaching for is greater than that negative effect. So our scenario that we're going to look at is John, and he is in severe pain. And I have to mention that because, a lot of us can deal, and I think, no offense, I think women, especially those of us who have had children, we've been in training, so we can endure pain, quite a lot of it, better than our male counterparts. But that we have to be careful not to be scared of all pain. I mean, we want to weigh that too. Sometimes, I know with my dad, he didn't want to be put out completely. He didn't want to just lay there unconsciously. So he did have to deal with some pain, but it was so that he could speak to us and hear us talking to him. So there's got to be a way in there. But we've got John. He is dying of severe pain. And I want you to read the scenario. And then what I'd like you to do, since we've got these beautiful tables, is I want you to first read it and then kind of group together and have a little discussion and answer those 4 questions. And then I'm going to review them with you, and I'm going to ask you your answers. So you might have to orient your chairs a little bit different, but read the scenario first. Normal dose, what I'm saying is, like, there's a dosage that's a safe dosage that doesn't have negative effects. And then there is that this doctor's put in this conflict of he may have to increase it above that safe level because it's not helping with the pain. And now that he's gone over that normal dose, and it's the effective, the minimum, they're trying to do the least amount but still be effective, is now at a level that might be a little bit suppressing the respiration or could cause some negative effects. So that's what I mean by that. And I don't mean to use that term to confuse you. I'm just saying that he's not cranking it up to the highest level of morphine or whatever. He is slowly incrementing it and finding that the person is not responding to it like they did initially and having to increase it. Okay, so that's what I mean by that. And now we're increasing it to a level that it's troublesome. It could be a problem. Here was asking, what if, when do we know when we can trust the doctor? And that is a really, really, really good question. And I got out of order, and I want to do this because this is a very important part of it before we get started. And I want you to keep the prayer. It's a simple prayer. We've been praying it for years, and it's the Holy Spirit prayer. Whenever you're doing what you did right now, and some of you may have blessed yourself and said a prayer together before you even got started. We did pray with Father, so that was certainly putting us in that mindset. But I would say we need to be very attentive and very purposeful on praying first. So right now I'd like us all to pray in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fires of your love. Send forth your Spirit, O Lord, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. Let us pray. God our Father, pour out the gifts of your Holy Spirit on the world. You sent the Spirit on your church to begin the teaching of the gospel. Now let the Spirit continue to work in the world through the hearts of all who believe, through Christ our Lord. Amen. We name the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen. We must pray. And that would answer even your question. If you have a bad feeling about the doctor, then you need to see if you can get a second opinion. Sometimes that's not offered. And then you've got to be what I call the hound dog advocate, where you are on top of that medical person. I mean, they just almost don't like to see your face. You're so on top of it. But to that gut, that feeling, your guardian angel, their guardian angel, go with it. Listen to it. Listen to them. And we're going to go through this question and see how we can get a feel of this doctor without even meeting him and come up with the answers. Because the first thing we say is the act of providing relief using the dosage that now we have to go up to in order to ease the pain morally licit. Does anybody think it isn't? We usually get that, because again, I was very careful to say extraordinary pain. And if we have means to relieve that, we should do that. Okay.
What swung me is it said effective dose might hasten his death. We don't know that for sure.
Right. And so she was hanging on the word might, which is also good. You want to see percentages, like how bad is this happening? And I have to say right now, and my medical people in the field, I have just recently been reading some articles on the negative effects of the painkillers, and they're finding that it's not what they originally thought. That it's sort of the chicken before the egg. Maybe the respiratory issues were there before the medicine was even involved. So they're doing a lot of research on this, especially at the end of life, and sedation, how much, and all of that is being very much looked at right now. What was the intent of the physician? To relieve the pain or hasten death? Okay, does anybody have a good gut feeling about this doctor? Okay, none of us really know him, but was there something in the scenario that made you think that maybe he wasn't out to kill him? Yes.
Because he brought up the fact that the dose might be.
Right.
Might hesitate or hasten his death.
So he brought it up, and remember, we're seeing this gradual movement too. So there would be no thought that he's doing something, that he's doing it in these gradual steps, that he's being mindful of the risks, and that would be another. Is that what you were going to say? Yeah. So we don't know for sure, and again, we're just consulting family members. We all love John. We care about John, so we're his advocates, and we're weighing these things in pretty seriously. Will John's suffering be relieved by the medicine or by his death? The medicine was our goal, and our hope in heaven is that upon his death, he is going to be in the happiest, most wonderful place called heaven, and one day we'll be seeing John. So not even being afraid of death, but the goal of this doctor was to relieve the pain and suffering. That was what he was going after. And again, this patient did die of respiratory failure, but it's hard to tell because he already had pulmonary disease, whether it really was the pain medicine or whether it was the condition. He was already dying. And then the fourth one is controlling John's severe suffering serious enough to justify this extra dose or this dose of drug that might be dangerous? And I think we all can unifiably say yes. It's a tough one because whenever we do something that takes a risk and that could harm us, we need to reflect. We need to pray. We need to get all our information together. I know one thing that I found I consult other families, but even in my own family, which I can share those a little more readily since I have permission to tell my own story, is that, we saw that morphine my dad was having terrible reaction to the morphine in so many ways. So I was like, is there something else you can give him for the pain? And they did give him something else that was much better, that he took better in his system. So, to just ask the questions, and that's where the advocates can be just so important. You know your loved one better than anybody else. So ask the questions. Don't be afraid. And they might bark at you a little bit and snarl at you and not be happy that you're on that chair for more than 24 hours. But, you're their advocate. And you know that you need to be there, or someone needs to be there. Yes.
Kathy, on number 4, it changes it a little bit because it says using the effective dose of a drug that hastens. It doesn't say might in number
Yes.
4. So
Yes.
that
Yeah, and I think yes, and this is, I probably should change that, as I said, because there's now some science kind of debating really the effects of particularly morphine on the suppression of the respiratory system. So it's something to keep an eye on. You never want to give too much drugs up to anyone. You don't want to, as Father said, knock someone out unconscious, and they don't need to have all that medication. So I would say, there's some research on it, and that, the scenario is that he did die, and he did die of respiratory failure, but he was already dying of cancer. And he was in the last and final stages. So it was kind of really hard to pinpoint if it was just, how things just kind of pile up at the end on the patient, if that was more of what we were seeing. Okay, now our second scenario. Oh, sure, please.
I can't emphasize enough that the drug world is changing very rapidly, and it does every week and every month. That there are alternative medicines coming that are almost obsoleting, like morphine drugs, without the side effects.
Yes, and I'm glad he made that comment, because sometimes when we do this, I'll get that comment. It's like, well, second opinion, which we heard up here, but also what I shared. I saw that my dad wasn't reacting well to the morphine at all, and so I inquired. So that asking, is there something else? I see this as hastening or has some serious side effects. I mean, drugs that we take, please read the side effects. Any of them. I don't care if it's an antibiotic. Please read the side effects. And then so you can weigh. So then you can weigh and also counterindications, because maybe the drug that you're taking or that your loved one is taking in the hospital is going to be offset something else. You can Google it. Yeah, and you need to look at it, because you just assume sometimes the doctor looked at it, but they may have forgotten, oh, your mom's on Coumadin. Okay, that's going to change this treatment plan. But you have to be there, again, the advocate, saying, making sure that they are considering all and weighing all and looking at other criteria, other options. Our second scenario that we're going to look at is actually one on benefits and burden. And this one's very, very tough. Father talked a little bit about a quality of life, and I said, make sure that, we all want to do the best to be healthy. We all want to make the best choices, but quality of life should never be an indication to say whether someone is good enough to be treated, or that they are less of a person just because they don't fit our criteria for quality of life. So we have to be careful that, although in itself it's a pretty mundane term, it can be used as a declining of treatment. It can be used as a declining of what is worthy and good for that patient. We're going to review this benefits and burdens, and this one is, I will already tell you, very tricky. And I think if you read it, I've put in a lot of details. This is, again, a very true story. We have a fairly young mom here with a 12-year-old, and she's got a serious cancer. And I want you to read this over again. Read it. The benefits and burdens is basically, you've got to weigh some objective criteria, like medical effectiveness of the intervention they're proposing here. Those are things that you can actually get a number or an idea of that, and we tried to include it in here. And then there's some subjective criteria, and just because it's subjective doesn't mean it's not valid. And those are things like, what is that effort going to be? What is the cost going to be? What is the pain going to be? Are we really looking at that probability of success? We have to look at tremendous fear, sometimes even repulsion to the procedure. Some people have a repugnance or a repulsion to it, and it may require talking with a therapist or a psychiatrist on, why. There might be depression involved, so we have to look at that too. And in all of these cases, please keep depression always in the back of your mind. I wish I didn't realize that when my dad was told he couldn't drive anymore, or my mom was saying that she was losing her eyes to macular degeneration, how much of a depression that had come in. I mean, I kind of saw it like my mom's being grumpy, or my dad, is being very quiet, but they were both dealing with that very heavy news. So we have to be aware, whether it has to be treatable depressions, another thing, let the professionals determine that, but be aware that these losing of self can be very difficult times. But I have to say, as difficult as it is, they can be great moments of grace. And I remember a woman telling me that her dad his brain was basically slowly being taken away by Alzheimer's to the point where he was in bed most of the time. She was I will never forget her, this beautiful woman. She like lit up because she had such strong faith. And she said, every time my dad loses something, whether it's a memory or ability, I can see Christ in him so much clearer. It's almost like I don't see my dad anymore, and I see the suffering Christ. And I thought, if that's something that we can use in this difficult journey, especially for those who may have dealings with dementia and Alzheimer's and your loved ones, is that instead of, we're going to mourn the person that we remembered in their vibrant stage, but that now what we have before us is Christ. And we can love them with all our hearts. And I just thought, my gosh, I never saw losing one's ability so transformed. And then I thought, my goodness, when Christ showed up after he resurrected, his wounds were still there. And light and his love shined through them. And that's going to be with our suffering and with our loved ones, and us suffering with our loved ones, which can be very painful. So this is probably a harder scenario. So I'm already warning you to get go in it. A lot of emotions. Try to feel what this family is feeling. It was a quick diagnosis. I don't know how long she had cancer, but I'm telling you, it hit, and within 8 or 9 months, she was gone. So I want you to put that in your mind, like this was the last thing anybody expected, and that we've got this young child who the mother was blessed with late in life, if you do the math. So if you can look at this and please read it, and then we'll talk about it. What do you all think? What are some questions that you have? Because a good consult, you should have more questions aimed at me than you should be telling me. So let's start. Okay. Yes.
Define aggressive.
Okay, that's a good question. And yours?
What it says, the family decided, was that family exclusive of married?
I am so glad that comes up every time.
Was that married who said one thing and the family said something else?
Yes. So I'll hit both of them. So yours was, again, your question? Define aggressive. So by aggressive, what I'm saying by aggressive is that it's going to involve some serious side effects, okay? That I didn't lay out, because there's so many different kinds of ways the chemo is being administered these days, but just assume that it's going to be filled with some side effects and not a pleasant experience.
And it said it wasn't going to prolong her life any more than the 4 months.
And
Yes.
20%.
And they gave a percentage, so that was something. And then you asked, was Mary consulted? And again, because I know the story, I can tell you, and this is going to be maybe when I tell you this, it might be your worst nightmare. Guess what Mary said? She said, I don't care. Do whatever the family wants. Okay. Well, you would say that, but I went to the room, and I'm telling you, I would say she was probably the holiest person I have ever been in contact with. I was in the room of a saint. She was ready to go. She was ready to fight. She loved her 12-year-old. And the 12-year-old, just so to give you a little background too, so this makes it a little harder, the 12-year-old had been doing novenas to Our Lady of Lourdes, and he was sure. He knew there were miracles at Lourdes, and he thought God was certainly going to do this miracle for him. So, I mean, for her. And so this is, again, where we run into that, okay, mom's trying to be mom, and mom is dying too. It's a hard position to be. So she's torn between that. Remember, Father was talking about that vocational cry of she's a mother of a 12-year-old. And 12-year-olds, as you all remember and know, really need their mother and their father. So this was very, very tragic. Very, very tragic. And those of you who may have lost a parent young in age definitely can say, I hear you. So this is the situation that she's up against. And honestly, she would have been happy either way. I saw it. I saw it when she said it. But it made it very difficult on the loved ones, I will say. And this was one of those cases where everybody was not united in their thoughts either. There were the pro-chemotherapy and there were the anti. Yes.
My problem with it is that because of the aggressive chemotherapy, she died 2 days later. She could have had the 4 months and put everything in order and made sure she had her relationships all cemented and
Okay,
everything
so
else.
again, this is remember, now we're looking at what is a beautiful example of benefit and burden, but also extraordinary care. Her with this prognosis is an extraordinary care. And another reason I like doing this scenario is extraordinary care says that you can say no. But extraordinary care, if it's not going to be a tremendous financial burden and the person is in agreement to do it, is also not a sin to say yes. So I want you all to be aware of it, because I think sometimes we're made more to feel guilty about saying yes to extraordinary care than we are about the opposite. So it's just a caution, because if you want to fight it and you're not going to be harming anybody and you're willing to say yes to it, then, that weighs into, it's not a moral wrong too. And you're, okay, if it was you, you're making that decision. No, I'm saying no to the chemo. I don't want the bad side effects, and I'm going to live these last 4 months out, and I'm going to get out of this hospital room, and I'm going to really live it. And that's certainly a good option. But you've got this other option of, come on, Mom, do it. The 12-year-old is come on, Mom, please, for me. I've been praying. Look, I got the holy water from Lourdes, the whole 9 yards. That puts, go, yes. And then we'll say.
Little respect, I'm a physician.
That's why I love that.
You're inferring that the chemotherapy is good, and you can't make that inference.
Yes.
People who have metastatic cancers die from a lot of complications. For example, blood clots in the lung, they may have a heart rhythm problem, things like that. And usually it's not the first round of chemotherapy. My suspicion is that she died not because of the chemotherapy, but for another problem.
Yes, and you're actually knowing a little more about the case. That's exactly what happened. The chemotherapy, the first dose, she had no negative results of it. Like she wasn't nauseous. It was really rather interesting that she had no negative effects. And they were planning, and she should have had negative effects, but she did not. So we're assuming with this case that she did die. But remember, they caught the cancer late. It was 4th stage. It was already metastasizing through her body, and I think we did say that in the scenario. So she was already in a really critical time. And I can't help but think that she knew she was near the end, and so she was like, whatever. And what that did for the young child was Mom fought it to the end. And Mom is the hero, and to this day, he's 40 years old and still, has this, beautiful vision of his time spent with his mom. Yes, Kurt.
I don't understand why the family chose the aggressive. They must have thought that this would make her live longer, right?
Yeah, I like that. But that's another question. Okay, why the aggressive? There are other things. So you want to ask, is there something else that we can do? But as my understanding, because I wasn't there when the doctor actually consulted with the family, was that he was really trying to discourage it in a big way. Not because he was, Dr. Death or anything, but he just really didn't think it was going to do any good. And so I don't know why they did the aggressive, why they chose it, but that would have definitely been, just like with the medicines, ask, what else can we do here? I realize it's all through the body. What other options do I have? Yes.
In situations like that, where the family or the patient is told you have X amount of time to live, somebody will Google, or somebody will talk to somebody who said, yeah, my Aunt Sally's in the same situation, stage 4 ovarian cancer, had 4 months to live, and $5, she got the chemo, and lived for a year. So that's the other thing that you have to factor in, is that people hear stories that, what I did critical care also, and one of the things I used to tell the house staff is, you regret your mistakes and you curse your successes. And the reason you curse the success, because you'll have a certain scenario where a patient who's critically ill, so there's no way this person is going to survive, and they survive. And the next time you have that patient with that similar scenario down the road, well, you knew that 99 of the patient took care of all died, this one lived. And so now you start thinking, well, maybe the situation will turn out to be the same. So my guess is that's why the family wanted the aggression, because they hoped and prayed and assumed that, 4 months, but nobody reads the future. And so mom may live another year or whatever, we're going to go for the dress ring.
And he's so right, and I'm just like thinking as you were saying, a case that just happened where we had a young 18-year-old, he was found in water at a pool, unconscious for 20 minutes. And those of that your medical will know that's not a good thing. 20 minutes, no oxygen to the brain is very serious. I visited him that day on the request of the parents, and it didn't look good. And they said he would never be conscious, that he would never speak, he would never see, and that they'd never see anything other than him just laying there on the ventilator. And they were having to make that decision whether to remove the ventilator or not. And it hadn't been fully 48 hours yet. Now, even in my own common sense, and I'm not a doctor, but I've seen cases, I made sure we had a priest and did an anointing. I thought we wouldn't see another 24 hours. For reasons I can't explain, and I do know he was anointed, he is talking, walking. His sight is still damaged, but he's making progress. He's actually gone from being able to follow light to seeing figures. It is a miracle. And I'm not saying that that's a reason that everybody should do what they did. All I'm just trying to say is that within that 48 window, that doctor, who was probably very right when he came and gave the bad news, was rather surprised to see what happened in the next 24 hours. So and they do. And I think that we should allow people to want the miracles and not judge them for it, but we also have to be there to be the realist as well. And when something is hurting, like if this had gone on and on with that woman and there was no good effects coming from that chemotherapy, to be able to reason with them and to walk with them and say, maybe it's time to stop. And that's a hard thing to do, but it's a walking. It's that accompaniment that Pope Francis is talking about. This is not fun. And it's removing your own personal opinion too, but also helping them think straight. Because remember what I said, emotional, frontal lobe, having trouble, working with them and helping them. Yes.
Had stomach cancer, and he had the chemo for about a year. And he had the chemo, and then it was for a whole year he was in remission. And then all of a sudden it came back with vengeance, and he was gone in no time at all. But I don't think, he didn't have any other options at that time because it was stage 4.
Yeah.
So they took half of his stomach, and then a year later.
And again, you think to yourself, well, maybe we should have said no at the beginning of the treatment, but the treatment allowed him some additional time with you. And, this time is like I said, every moment's precious. Every breath is precious. All of you sitting in here, I don't see anybody that's, chronically ill that I can see in front. And yet, what I would say is that, we need to make our lives mean something, and our breath every breath we take, whether we're praying or whether we're an advocate or whether we're just doing good for our neighbor, that, our life matters. And so in that short period of time, there were family relationships that needed to be mended. This is the time. And I've seen it. I know Father Kirby could speak a whole lot on the beautiful reconciliations that happen at even with people with their faith and with God. So we always want to weigh that all in on our decision. But I think what I tried to do with this scenario is that if I didn't give you all those details, you might have said one thing, but when I started filling it in, it made it a little more complicated. And that's what real life looks like. And that's why you have to ask the questions. And if you have more questions, and I love this one in particular, just I can hear it. You all were like stirring. It brings out so many questions, and that's so good. Yes.
When my own mother was dying, I learned a lot of new terminology, and one of them that I learned was palliative care. And it terrified my mom when we went into the hospital, and they wanted to bring in and everything's moving fast in our modern world, as some of you have already said. So they brought in the team of the palliative care team. And she was like, "They're here to kill me." That's what she thought. I didn't know what it meant, but I went out into the privacy of the hallway to learn what this palliative care. And so, versus say hospice. So, but my mother did not understand that she had a terminal glioblastoma, that all of her care, which they offered to her, was palliative, because it was not going to heal her. It was going to help her with her quality of life so she could go through this spiritual journey, so that anything that needed to be done, because the glioblastoma was terminal within a certain amount of time. It was less than 5 months. But so just 2 days ago, I was having a discussion with one of my daughters who's on her way to being a pediatric oncologist about the Kenner Fellowship. And Katie, we were talking specifically about palliative care and the illicitness of it. And, palliative care is legitimate. When you have a diagnosis like this, it can be legitimate to take this and do it. What you need to do is you discern morally through prayer, even though it's with the medical diagnosis barring miracle. So I think the point of my comment is there are terminology that we don't know, and it might hit us in the middle of this very difficult situation. And in the case of my mother, I was there to be her advocate and single-minded. And if you were put in that position, God will give you the grace to do that, but be open that there's experiences that even this class will not prepare you.
And I would say with palliative care, just as a warning, like I could do a separate talk on that, and I can't, not with the time I'm running out as it is, but that I want to say that be careful. Palliative care, I went to an international conference on palliative care, so I heard different faith communities, and what I've seen with palliative care, at least on an international view, is it's taking a turn. So you have those that have a Christian, Judeo-Christian ethos or religious, and those that don't. And the one that doesn't, it's utilitarian. So it's how do I get them out of the bed and dead? I mean, and it's utilitarian. They're going anyway. How do I speed this up and move the bed and treat somebody who has a chance? And I know, what am I speaking of? I heard it. I heard someone, and he was from Berlin, and it was a secular palliative care. And I heard him say that it was cruel to have someone be left alive where they're drooling, that was cruel to keep them alive. And I heard him, and he said it in front of the whole international community. So there's different approaches, but palliative care and hospice care were both developed by the church. Palliative, the word in Latin means to cloak with love. So it is a beautiful concept. And there are wonderful palliative care units and people. So don't be scared of them, but realize that we're in the midst of a battle. And if you haven't already seen it, that's why advocates are good, because the advocates can be standing up for that person and weighing options and looking. It's not to be naive and hear a word and just like hospice care. It had such a great reputation. The sisters started it, but to be discerning on what hospice care you decide to go with. See what other people say. Look at what their mentality is, and then make your decision from there. But there is and I would say protocol over people sometimes in treatment, and that's what we as advocates make sure, that they always see the human person, the dignity of the human person, and that we do our research. And I think this is part of what this one does. The last scenario, I'm going to have you read it, but we won't have time for you all to go through it. I'm just going to run through some key points because Father did lay this one out very well. Anybody want to venture?
Well, I wanted to know how he could logically make that decision if he has Alzheimer's, how he could functionally say,
I. The natural history of Alzheimer's
Yeah, he's
disease.
What?
gotta eat.
I'm sorry, the natural history of all, medicine, we talk about the natural history of the disease. If you step back and just watch it and don't intervene, then what's the outcome? Natural history of Alzheimer's disease is over time, they forget to eat or drink. It just goes away. So I'd be surprised if he decided,
that's what I'm
actively
saying.
decided, as opposed to the disease process getting to the point where he can no longer say or think, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, whatever. And then again, the question I had is, when you talk about Pat suffering, how do you know he's suffering?
Well, no, that's a very good point. That is actually a very good point, because I think we make that assumption that just because someone has Alzheimer's that they are suffering. I love that you brought that up. I think it's just a natural, they've lost their knowledge, but they are not always suffering. And in reality, that might be the reason someone says, don't, stop the feeding and the hydration, because they've got Alzheimer's, they've lost their mind. You wouldn't want to be kept alive in that condition, would you? So it's a wrong thought, but that's a beautiful concept, because a lot of times they are not suffering. That is very true. The family members are suffering. Let's get that very clear when you see your person fading away, but sometimes they are not. And we did mention he was healthy, so that was a very good point. Yes?
I have a question with, when, I know for a fact that if they don't eat and you prompt them, they will.
Okay.
Except then, when they start choking, that's a whole different thing.
Okay. So in that choking is what Father was talking about, when we feed them or give them drink in a way that they're not benefiting from, then you have to either find a new way or look at whether this is benefit burden. If it's extraordinary or ordinary, you have to revisit all those concepts. But the thing of it is that the point that she's bringing up, I think, is that can we look to see if there's something else going on? Is the patient depressed? They can still be depressed and have Alzheimer's or dementia. Is that what the issue is? Is it depression? Is it the fact that they forgot to eat? I mean, I forget to eat. It happens, Or is it, or is there something else that can be done? My daughter is a nurse, and she worked for 2 years in an Alzheimer's clinic. And she found that as a nurse, when this came up, she barely ever had to restrain and put a feeding tube in when it was at this level, assuming health and all that. It was just knowing the person. Like, one, if you prayed the Our Father, he would automatically start eating. Another was he was a singer, so if he heard music, it changed everything. So to be creative, and who knows best, is the family members. And one thing she told me that really stuck with me was that when the family members were there, they would eat. When the family members were gone and weren't visiting on a regular basis, they would not. And that almost makes me think that there was something sad and depressing going on in their minds. But that the ideal of that we need to be more creative, but that at the end of the day is that if they're assimilating that liquid and hydration, even though we hate to see them in the state that they're in, that we must give it to them. It's similar in my mind, because we try to look at the dignity of the person, is that if some young woman had anorexia and didn't want to eat and was very adamant about it, we would do everything in our power to try to get them to eat, everything in our power. And so with this this patient. And Alzheimer's doesn't always strike at old age. It can be a younger patient in their 50s. But that we do what we can, even though it's hard, and we love them where they're at, and we try to look at creative ways before we look at invasive ways to try to help them eat. Any other questions or comments? So tough. Yes.
There's Alzheimer's, it's in the process. They have given her like 46 weeks to live. But when I was there the other day, her and her husband, we got her, like sit, kind of up in the bed. And they have it all set up when you give her a push straw in the mouth. And you tell her to suck. And she might only take 2 tablespoons. And then she goes right back to sleep. So to force a tube into somebody.
Yeah, you do everything, certainly do everything in your power to help the person. But even that young man that I told you that nearly drowned, he was being fed by the tubal feeding, and he came off of it. And it wasn't quite as, when he was really coming conscious and starting to move around, he certainly didn't want it in there anymore, but I wouldn't say that he was they had to give him any kind of pain meds for him having that. So it depends on how the tubal feeding is, whether they're inserting, whether it's going down the throat, how it's being done. But again, hoping that that's the last resort, but also knowing that they need that food and water. Any other questions or comments? Because I'm going to put you on a break, yes? Oh, so what, any of these, there is not a right or wrong answer. I think that's what you're kind of probably seeing. So in this one, based on the facts that I've given you, we do want to make sure that we do everything in the power that they get food and nutrition. That would be the last resort, but if there's no other alternative, you would do this. And it is done. They'll sedate, they'll do a mild sedation if you really have an obstinate patient. And some of them can be very physically strong and obstinate, for those who've treated or have that in their family. But that, we don't starve and thirst a person to death. It goes back to that. We just don't do that. We don't do it to a dog. We don't do it to human beings, no matter what. And one point I did want to make that to go along with what the doctor said is, it is a progressive disease, and there will be a point where that food and water is no longer being processed in their body at all anymore. Everything starts to shut down, and they will naturally pass and die on their own. And that at that point, you don't want them to blow up because they're not eliminating waste or any of that. So there's a point where if it's not doing the patient any good, then we don't want to force it. But at the same time, we don't want people to die from thirsting and starving to death. And that's really the key that you do, because it might be we're thinking good, we don't want to force food on people, we don't want to make them uncomfortable, but at the same time, we don't do an evil so that a good end comes. All right, so I know that was very heavy and it was a lot going on. The fact of the matter is, and I hope this brought more questions and answers, is that these cases are complicated. You need the help of a good God in prayer, and you need to consult with people that you know. In this room, you've already heard some voices and some good souls. You know where you can consult, and starting with your pastor. When someone who is Jewish has an ailment, the very first person they go to is their rabbi. Should we not first go to God in the persona Christi of our own pastor and hear what he has to say before we venture these very turbulent waters that will be calm if we walk with the Lord? Thank you.
Sorry, I was about 15 minutes late. I drove up from close in between Beaufort and Charleston is where I live, so it's kind of a hike from here. And I've got 2 kids under 2 that didn't want to sleep last night. So all those burdens that were discussed, they're not burdens. They're just little bundles of joy, right? So I serve in many roles at the diocese. I'm the lobbyist for the Catholic Church at the State House, do a lot in communications, and then I also help our Catholic schools with development efforts. So my areas of work are varied, and I do not practice law, so you're not getting a legal opinion today from the church. I am just simply someone that knows how laws work, and that's what I do on your behalf in Columbia. So first, I want to give a personal story. I'm young, and a lot of people will say, oh gosh, this guy has no idea what he's talking about. Can you not hear me? Difficult to hear. Typical. I'm a Yankee. That shouldn't be the way it is. Although I'm sure there are no Yankees in this room, right? Yeah. Okay. I thought so. Any New Yorkers? I thought I heard a few accents around here. But God bless South Carolina, right? We're all happy to be here. So I may be young, as I said, and a lot of people will say it automatically, oh, this guy's young, he has no idea what he's talking about. But I've been through this myself, most recently in April with my grandmother, oldest Italian grandson, so very near and dear to me. We were very, very close. And she passed away, and the situation that we went through her passing was not positive. I wasn't the agent, and neither was someone who was practicing. And although I did assert myself and try all the tricks that we provide to you here today, she still was not provided nutrition and hydration as she should have been. And so she did not have a very peaceful passing, and there was a lot of debate in the house as to what should be done. So I'm not a rookie at this. We've been through this before, and I just wanted to share that we do, all of us face this no matter how old we are, right? So why are we here today? Euthanasia. Anybody heard of it? Okay. It's a wave. It's a tidal wave. It was in 26 jurisdictions this year. 26. We defeated them. The church is obviously involved in this in many ways, but we defeated all 26 of them. You will not see that the Catholic Church is out front on it. We have hired consulting firms in all of our major states that are fighting this, because when the church speaks in this era, people don't listen always, right? We all know that. So Archdiocese of Boston, Archdiocese of Denver, LA, and although they're in court and obviously had that whole debacle over there, but we are opposing this everywhere. So we anticipate and see the wave coming. 26 jurisdictions talking about the issue. It's legal in, I believe, 6. And so we need to be educating people about what the church teaches. It's not a scary teaching, right? You just spent an hour and a half with these two wonderful people going through our teaching. It's not scary, is it? It's loving, right? It's merciful. It's beautiful. It's a lot better than medicating someone to death, right? It's a lot better than that. So we're here because that's coming, and we need to be aware of what's going on. That's the big issue, right? The looming issue at 30,000 feet. But in reality, we all have somebody. This is going to either happen to a loved one, to our parents, to ourselves, and we need to be ready for that end-of-life discussion. And you can't just assume that as soon as it happens, you're going to jump right in and know what to do, right? So that's why the diocese, I believe it was 5 years ago. I think it was about 5 years ago. The three of us came together 5 years ago and started working on this. And the booklet before you is new. This is recent. It's a new document we put together probably in the last 6 months. And I'm going to add that the legal document that is there is still being worked on. This is the version from a year and a half ago. But we're working on another version now because we're always trying to make sure that we update. And the code, South Carolina code, changes every year, right? So if you fill this out now, it's still grandfathered in. It's not a matter of that, but I'm just letting you know another version will be released, and we'll be sure that gets to Father. We track what parishes we go to, and then they can send it out to everybody so they have that. But there's nothing wrong with the one here. We just like to keep everything, all the code numbers up, and then if anything else changes, we like to stay on top of that. But we wanted to provide a resource. There's a lot of confusion around end-of-life care, a lot of confusion, and so we came together as a team, and this is what we've come up with, this program where we teach the theology and then provide the practical implications. Then I step in and provide the legal document. What we have given is something that we've had 12 attorneys look at. And actually, I just met someone else here today we're going to send it to her husband, and he's going to look at it. And they have taken the code, which was written by the Hemlock Society. Anybody know who the Hemlock Society is? Okay, so they're the new Compassion and Choices. So they're the pro-euthanasia, pro, as they say, death with dignity organization. And so when our code was written, it wasn't written with Catholic teaching in mind. It wasn't written with preserving life in mind. It was written with an agenda. And so when you look at the code, there are some glaring concerns that it's very difficult to work within sometimes, although we have, I think, done a very good job. But that's where this came from. We brought a lot of attorneys together, different areas of the state, different parishes, and tried to work some of our teaching into a document that is flawed, or a code that is flawed. Any attorneys in the room? No? Any legal assistants in the room? No? Go ahead. Were your points? Oh. Oh. Oh, you did? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see you. Good. And what did you practice in? Corporate. Okay, so a little different. But still, concepts matter. So we are very happy to be here. How many people have a document, a legal document about healthcare? Their healthcare. Okay, good. How many people have a living will? How many people have a healthcare power of attorney? You have a living will. Okay. So I'm going to quote somebody that you all might know. Anybody heard of South Carolina Citizens for Life? No? Okay, I'm just going to quote her. Her name's Holly Gatling. She's a sharp lady. She used to be a reporter for the state, and now she's the lobbyist for the life issue in the state, along with the Catholic Church, of course. But she said, a living will has so many holes in it and so many opportunities for failure that you can drive a hearse through it. Okay? So just keep that in mind. We're providing you something where you're maintaining a minimum Catholic standard is what we're calling it, and you're delegating all the other authority to an agent of your choice, not a physician who is tied down by malpractice and all this other concerns, money issues, right? You're delegating to an agent. It is, this is your, just keep that in mind. We would recommend living wills in South Carolina are not written well. Consider a healthcare power of attorney. And this document is not, this is not us saying you should sign this. We want you to go seek counsel. You should take this to your lawyer and execute it. You should not be executing this without someone else having their eyes over it. We're just providing guidance to some attorneys that may or may not understand Catholic teaching or may not understand our thoughts on healthcare. So there are, of course, Catholic lawyers in the area. I think that one of them advertises in the back of your bulletin, which is great. So he understands, especially with 12 kids, healthcare concerns, I'm sure. But that's not the case for all of our communities in South Carolina. The Catholic Church was a very small presence up until about, 10, 15 years ago. And so we just want to give guidance to everybody, no matter where they live, whether it's outside of a very booming Catholic area or in the rural community where I live, where there's only 2 Catholic families in my town. Can you believe that? 2. So you got to help out everybody. So I just want to go through a few words that we don't use, and I do this in mind because you'll see them in here. People are not burdens, right? I know Father said that, and he said it very funny. But I know at the end of my grandmother's life and previous to that, my uncle's life, burden was used so frequently by the patient, by the family member. Let's correct that. Don't use the word burden, right? And if you do, turn it into a joke. But they're not burdens, right? And they're not vegetables. Okay, a consistent vegetative state, when they use the word vegetable, we're not vegetables, we're humans. And we are not a vegetable. So don't say that they're vegetables. And quality of life, right? We like to use that word, but it can get twisted. Be careful when you use it. Some people, as Father described in his talk, will say quality of life includes golf. Golf's great. I love golf too, but I got 2 kids, so I have no golf. 2 kids under 2, right? So quality of life, just be very careful with the term. It is true. That is a good word, good phrase to use to describe what the patient is experiencing, and palliative care can be helpful in that. But do not forget that people can assume that just because they're drooling, which I get tired sometimes, 2 kids under 2, right? Drooling can occur. That they are not unworthy of life because things are starting to fall apart, right? Quality of life, be careful. It doesn't mean that you're perfect, upstanding, able to go on your long walks and go golfing. And this is something that I just remember clearly from when my grandma was around. I just want to add this. When someone is dying, they can hear you. And sometimes their senses are higher, right? So they can hear even more. And so I'm just picturing right now, my grandma was in the living room, and she had 5 boys, no girls. And they're all within 6 years of each other. So the boys are just, they're all there. They're all very big personalities, and they're talking real loud. And some of them are saying things that maybe grandma shouldn't be hearing right now, right? Maybe about her care or whatnot. But she could hear. I knew she could because I was right by her side. Just remember that when this is going on, while we're in chaos ourselves, we're feeling all that stress, that we want grandma or whoever's there to hear all the wonderful things that he or she would want to hear near the end. Not that there's fights about what we're going to do when she's gone. Not about, she likes pink or white. No, grandma doesn't need to know that we forgot what color she wanted, So those are just a few things I wanted to add based upon what I heard. So this document, which is very short, you will find other documents in the state that are optional. There's the Will to Live that's done by another organization. They're long. They're very, very long. And we have one doctor in the room, is that correct? Or are there others? Just one? So, and I'm sure this is true, if you get a 50-page healthcare power of attorney, do you take time to read through all sections of power of attorney? So we were very sensitive. We have a group of people in the state that we consulted that are physicians, not just lawyers, and we said, listen, we know we have to do something. We know our teaching is very elaborate, and I think Kathy has an example of someone she went to school with that had a 78-page healthcare power of attorney. No doctor has time for that. They don't. No nurse. Any nurses in the room? There's got to be a few. No nurse has time for that either. We kept this so short. Cover to back page, 11 pages. And some of it is directions and mumbo jumbo that no one needs to read, right? We kept it short for a reason. We want it to be accessible and usable. We also, in addition to creating this, we sent this off, and I met with tax advisory councils of lawyers in certain communities. We sent it to hospitals. We sent it to doctors. We spread it around. So when this arrived in a hospital or arrived at a lawyer's office, it wasn't the first time they were necessarily seeing it. Now, I'm not saying everyone got one or everyone read what they got, but we did distribute this around so people knew the Catholic Church was providing some guidance to the faithful. So this document is short. It is also the minimum Catholic standard, right? Just the minimum. We don't provide any guidance above what we believe to be important, which Father Kirby went into and Kathy described. We believe people deserve to be cared for, right? They deserve nutrition and hydration unless it's a burden on them, right? Causes an issue. Their body doesn't assimilate the water or hydration. We also believe that you can't, if the woman is pregnant, she can't make decisions for herself, we don't abort the child, right? That's Catholic teaching. We don't do that. And I'm going to go through the most important piece of this document, I think, other than a few of the clauses, is who you pick as agents, okay? So I know, because I'm from an Italian family, actually, half is Italian, half is British, but the half that's Italian, they love birth order. It really matters if you're the eldest. It really does, and those that are Italian understand that that's true. Do not pick an agent. You keep laughing, you must be Italian. Do not pick your eldest son because he's your eldest son. Pick the child that actually is going to understand what's going on, even if it's the youngest one, right? It's okay. Don't pick someone because you get along with them the best necessarily either. That's a good thing. You want to get along with them. You want the one who's going to make the right decision, right? Don't pick the hippie surfing child that lives in California. Hey, it's done. It's really done. People struggle with this. Pick someone who's going to understand. Because in the moments when this is going on, you as the person, this is about you right now, this document is you, you're not going to, when this goes into effect, you don't have the ability to make a decision. You're relying upon the person you're picking, and you have to pick three. First, second, and an alternative. It's hard. This is why Catholics have lots of kids, right? Many options. Another quick thing, location matters. We have a lot of people that move down. This is so common, and they have nobody really close by. There are kids that are further away. Now, it's okay. You should pick family. Please, pick your kids. But do keep in your mind that the son that lives on the other side of the country, getting a call at 2 in the morning to make a decision when he cannot get to you immediately, is going to be a lot more stressful on the whole situation. Do keep location in mind. It's not something that you should just take, oh, he's in California, forget him. But just keep that in mind. Location does make a difference. That person being on site is important. They need to be able to advocate for you. I'm sure our doctor can also say that advocating for patients is important. It is. And so being local or closer by is important. So in this document, you will pick 3 agents. Very important that you review this ever so often. Everyone looks pretty young here. No one, you do. No, you do. We go to some parishes where it's a lot older. Well, 97.
You guys are young.
No one in here is in their 90s, right? No. And no one looks like they're knocking on death's door either. And so you will likely have to look at this more than once. Do not do this, set it in the safe, and not look at it. You want to know why? Because your agents are going to die. Or they're going to move out, or they're going to move on, or you're not going to be close to them anymore. You've got to look at this frequently, maybe every couple years. Maybe your will, hopefully people look at their will every once in a while too. Keep this in that same rotation. Take a look. You know, you might pick your brother or sister because you're really close to them and they're younger. Well, maybe they predecease you, right? Or maybe their health has gone so downhill they can't be relied upon to be available to be your agent. So please review this frequently. Who to give it to, right? So hopefully those of you that have one will take a time to maybe look at the one they have or adjust according to what we've provided here. When you're done with whatever you come up with, whether it looks like this or doesn't, please make sure the agents you have assigned it to get a copy. A lot of times we forget, like, oh, they're an agent. I'll tell them. I'll call them on the phone and tell them. Well, that's good. That's good. And you should have a conversation. It is probably worthy of them coming over or you going over to their home and discussing what you're putting them in charge of, right? It's not an easy situation they're going to have to face. But also make sure they have a copy. Make sure your doctor has a copy, right? When you go into the hospitals, not all of them, but many of them, they'll make you sign a living will as soon as you arrive. If you don't have one, they'll make you sign something. Now, it's not forced, but you might feel forced, especially if you don't know what you're signing. You know, you go to the hospital, you get all these things you got to go run through, right? If you already have one, you already know you're going to go to. There's only one hospital really close to me. I know exactly where I'd go. That hospital needs to have one in their electronic system, already ready to go, right? I'm already in there. And then beyond that, accessibility. We can put it in your safe, sure. Stick the original in there. But don't put it somewhere where people aren't going to find it. It's very, very common that people have no idea where to look. They don't. The kids have no idea, or even the spouse doesn't. And I know this. My wife, I'll get to you. My wife her skill set is everywhere else. She's very artistic, like unbelievable artist. I do all the finance for the house. My wife would have no idea where to look. And I know that today. I should probably call her and tell her. But she would have absolutely no idea, and it is so common. One spouse is really all over this. That's the complementarity, right? This is why marriage is so important. Complementarity. Make sure when you're gone or you're about to go, they know where it is. Because sometimes us type A's that take the reins on these things might label it well in our mind, but for our artistic our spouse, they have no idea. They have no idea that it's on the right side of the closet, behind, X, Y, and Z. So just keep that in mind. So now I'm going to walk through the document with you, and I'm just going to, you first. Yes. No, the original I would stick inside of a safe. That I would, but then copies need to be made available everywhere.
I would say multiple copies because we did run into that problem.
But if they come in with a copy, is that valid for the hospital to? Oh, okay.
Yes. Yes. The only difference would be if it was to be, now hopefully this doesn't happen, but sometimes it does, especially with families, and we got large families in Catholic households, if siblings disagree about the authenticity of the document. So if someone says, no, mom and dad would never say that, no way, then you go get the original from the safe. Otherwise, you want that to be protected. Copies are fine. The electronic system that most hospitals use today, it's not an original either. It's a scan of an original. Yeah. Yeah, and I do not. I wish I had them. I actually had to have them make copies of this because I left it in Charleston. But we have little index cards, and I will ship some up here. We have little business card-sized cards that go in your wallet that says where your HCPOA is located. So you can say, it'll say in your wallet, they can pull it out, my name is, I'm a Roman Catholic, I need last rites. It says that on the front. And then on the back, it says the location of your healthcare power of attorney. Who has it? So I'll get that to Father, and I'm sorry we don't have that today. I've been 2,200 miles this week, and I didn't have a chance to get it. Go ahead. In your freezer. Yep. Yep, you can do that too. That's fine. Doesn't matter. That's perfectly fine. They know where to look. Yep. So if you're in, and this going back to Grandma from April, and I never take time off because my job is so crazy lately, but I took off 19 days and stayed up there with her, and we had everything on the fridge. Like it was there, very prominently placed, so that there was no question. We knew where it was. If you're in that point of the discussion, it should be somewhere easily accessible, not lost in a pile on the counter. Okay, so let's go through the document. I'm not going to go through it paragraph by paragraph necessarily. I'm going to highlight things that might strike you. But as I said, this is something that you definitely want to discuss with your attorney. And obviously, you've got someone in the parish, or I'm sure you have more than one attorney in the parish. So I think it starts with page 1. Trying to flip this over. Microphone, I can't do it with one hand. Okay, so it is page 1, but the second page 1, right? South Carolina Healthcare Power of Attorney. Information about this document. This is just the instructions. That's it. You're not going to fill it out because you're not the lawyer, right? So don't worry about it. But if you want to read through this, it's just basically telling you what the document does. The next page, page 2, is who can act as your witness. You need 2 witnesses on this. If you execute this with a lawyer, they're probably going to do it with their staff, right? They'll have their secretaries come in or another lawyer in the office come in. But it goes through everybody that can and cannot sign, right? Or this goes through who not, sorry. It's everyone who cannot sign on this. And so that would include someone that can benefit financially from you. Wonder why? Of course not, because they might sign up and let you die a little sooner. I'm just kidding. But the point is the who not, the who cannot sign. That's all it is, okay? Who cannot sign is on that. As a witness, yes. As a witness. This 2 witnesses to this. So let's go to page 3. Very easy, right? And the witness part is really simple. It's just who cannot financially benefit. That's basically what it is. So pick a random neighbor, or if you go to a lawyer like we're advising you to, they'll take care of that. That's really not a big concern. If you're going to do this on your own, which you can literally print this off from the South Carolina Code website, straight off the code, you could execute this straight without having to go to a lawyer. You should. That's what we keep saying, right? Not a legal opinion. Get a lawyer. But ours is obviously different than the one from the South Carolina Code. But if you are to go and do it on your own, you would need to make sure those witnesses do not fit that criteria. All right, so page 3. I, Michael Ecolano, hereby appoint Hope, my wife, who lives at said address, all those contacts, and then 2 agents after her, right? She's my primary agent because she's my wife. And although she's artistic, she's very smart when it comes to these things. I'll be just fine. Type A personality. Makes me nervous. And then first alternative and second alternative, right? So you'd pick 2 other people, right? You put them down, address and telephone. These are the things that change, right? People move. Got to make sure that that's accurate. Okay, let's go on to page 4. The top of page 4, number 3, is probably one of the most important paragraphs of the document. And I believe Father Kirby would have addressed it because I know him well, but I was not here for the first part. The ethical and religious directives. Anybody ever heard that term before? The ERDs? Basically, it is the Catholic Church's teaching on end-of-life care. And it's a living document. It changes every so often. I don't think we've had an edit since 2009, though. Is that correct?
No, and it's medical care in general. It covers a wide range, but they do have a focus here. But it's many pages
It's
long.
everything.
And it's to help the doctors that are Catholic and Catholic patients know what those parameters are.
So we tie this document to that faith-based statement. So as the teaching of the church continues to develop, and we know that that happens, right? We learn more, science reveals more to us, that we then tie to the teaching of the church on end-of-life care, right? And so that's what that does. Section 3 ties us to the ERDs, which is the acronym that represents that. So that's really important because we want to embrace that. And of course, you know, that can be difficult, but I hope that the presentation before helps you feel more comfortable with the church's teaching. You know, we're not saying, a lot of people, I know this definitely was when we first started this 5 years ago, a lot of people thought that the church taught that you had to do absolutely everything up until the nth hour and do everything you can, no matter what. And as you heard, it's definitely much more of a loving, caring, care-centered approach. And so hopefully that makes people feel comfortable. 6 is where we're going to run through some of the direct changes that were made to the document. So in the South Carolina Code, nutrition and hydration is something that can be excluded. Does that sound crazy to you? So you you can actually, in the one written for South Carolina, written by the Hemlock Society, you can actually, by saying you don't want extraordinary care, by doing that, you actually say, I don't want nutrition, hydration. Okay, so we have changed that here and taken that out, and I'm not going to go through the legal language of it, but we actually, life-sustaining procedures, we say that does not include nutrition, hydration. Why? Because you can't elect that you want extraordinary care or life-sustaining procedures and say you don't want water or food. Why? Because that's always necessary unless your body doesn't assimilate it. So we backed that out and changed that. And you see in point C, I want food and water unless, and then it goes through the whole Catholic that you learned from Father Kirby, the disproportionate care and whatnot. So the code is written to say you can exclude nutrition hydration. We have removed that as an option of removal and actually written directly in what we believe, right? That's what part C is. B is taking it out. C is saying our teaching. D, CPR. We don't talk about CPR in this. Why? Because right now, if any one of us drop, everyone looks pretty good. We should all be getting CPR, right? We don't want you to elect to say, no, you don't want CPR right now, because we're fine, right? If you need to go to that next level, there's more documents that can be done to take care of that, but we direct that this doesn't involve that. Right now, CPR. We'll go down to abortion and stem cells, right? We do not believe in using embryonic stem cells, which hopefully you never have to use them because there are no cures from them. Embryonic stem cell research has proven to be useless, but we put that in here because it is a growing area of research that people like to spend a lot of money on, and it proves to do nothing, but we're still putting it in there. And we also have pregnancy in here. If you're pregnant, right, you don't get to abort my child. Why? Because that's a violation of what we believe to be a life. And so that's in here as well. Let's go on to the next page. Agent's powers, part 7. The agent that you select, so I selected my wife, Hope, she can make all decisions above and beyond what I have elected in here. So they're not allowed to violate that minimum Catholic standard I keep referencing, but they can make all of the decisions above and beyond that. So that's what that section is. Organ donation is completely fine. It's great. The only problem would be what's going on in Europe. I think people have probably heard about this. There's some nations where you'll die, they'll bring you back to life, they'll cut out some organs and then let you go again. That's not okay. We're not going to be okay with that. And then it also mentioned in here is you cannot take any reproductive organs for the purposes of transplantation. And definitely with our current culture and where we are with some of the gender dysphoria and some of the issues that are going on, we have to be a little bit more aware of what's going on with reassignment surgeries and whatnot. So that one's good there. Part 9 is revocation of your previous living will, right? So if you have a previous document, we revoke it so that this says this is now the new one. And that does happen. Sometimes people will say, no, I know mom and dad did one in 07, but then you need this to be executed at a later date to show this is the new one. You revoke the prior one. And now we're going to go through part C of this. This goes through where you start making choices. So if you've noticed by now, there are not many changes you make, right? You make the selection of an agent, 2 or 3 of them. You can pick whether or not you want to donate your organs. And then here's where you have another option, terminal condition. So you have a terminal condition, right? You're going to die shortly. You elect whether you want to go extraordinary care or if you want to withdraw, if you don't want the extraordinary care, right? And this is one of those tough situations where you're electing to do more, to keep going along and fight harder, or if you just want to receive comfort care and nutrition hydration as we elected above, right? So this all depends on where you are in life and the discussion you just learned before. You elect either or. And then the next one is permanent unconsciousness, right? People like to use the word vegetative, which is in the 3rd line. We don't like that word, but it's in the code. Same thing, if you're permanently unconscious, you would direct whether or not you wanted to go above and beyond, right? Go to that extra mile, keep taking all the extraordinary care, or withdraw them and continue just to receive nutrition and hydration, if that makes sense. Does that make sense, what I just said? Yeah, it does. Okay, very good. And then 11 is where you would add anything miscellaneous. And this is really important for those of you that might have a chronic condition or something you've lived with your whole life, and there's something particular to that condition that you'd like mentioned. It's not uncommon for people to want to do that. All I ask, though, is that if you do that, that is vetted through your lawyer, because you do not write something in here and expect that it'll be interpreted the way you wrote it. You really want to make sure that an attorney is looking at this. Very important. I think I've said that probably, 12 times now? Lawyer, lawyer, lawyer. Do not write something, especially even if you are a lawyer, do not write something and assume it'll be taken the way you meant it. People have a way of interpreting things differently, so make sure that is reviewed. 12 is simply that if an agent is unavailable, right? I pick my wife and she's off in Curacao and can't be reached. I still want this document to be carried forth as written, right? And then you sign and date it. That's the end. And then page 9 is the witnesses, right? No one that can benefit from you, right? So if you're leaving all your money to somebody, do not let them sign as a witness. And as I said, if you have an attorney, that won't be a problem. If you're going to execute this on your own, you should definitely do the notary part at the bottom. Bottom part, not required, but it's a very important document. And if it ever is challenged, you want to make sure you have that at the bottom. All right. Any questions about, let me go through one other thing really quickly. So if you do live in North Carolina, or if you have a second home in Hawaii or Florida or something else, you should try to get another document for that state. This will likely work. Doctors normally do not challenge it. We've not seen that, at least. But I can connect you, and I have cards. You can reach out to me, and I can connect you to the diocese there and their documents. So not all of them have a document. A lot of them just have guidance. They provide a few paragraphs that you can add into yours. Some have something just like this, but it just depends on the priorities of that diocese. So, but I will happily connect you. You should certainly consider that. It's very common for people to still have their homes up in New York, all of us New Yorkers here. So do have two if you need to. Go ahead, Doctor.
Two questions.
Yep.
Does the church recognize brain death?
That's
We
fine.
do.
Yep.
So we don't prefer it, but it is recognized as death and could be used in terms of moving forward on some of the other treatment or lack of treatment. So brain death's recognized is not preferable. We prefer this age is plainly like heart death, but brain death we accept at this point. I know there's some questions right now being raised from more theologians, but in terms of the magisterium, brain death is sufficient.
Second question, if we go back to page 5, under C, food and water, in the second to last sentence, toward the end of it, there's the disproportionate burden. Would you define disproportionate burden? And the reason I bring this up, I think it's one thing if you decide to feed somebody where they can assimilate, but then you could logically extend this to if the gut doesn't work. Modern medicine can feed people by vein. It's called total parenteral nutrition, where you get carbohydrates and protein and electrolytes and so on. So we can sustain a body for an extended period of time through TPN. So would you give some...
So I'm going to let, that's more Kathy or Father. Yeah, go ahead.
I would say with that, it's a
Discernment in what is extraordinary now. Again, are we going beyond what is helpful to the patient? We don't want them to die from starvation. And I know there's different ways to feed and to give nutrition. I mean, even as my dad, we made sure that he was getting the fluids, even though we knew death was imminent. But what I'm saying here is that we still would do everything possible as long as the body is assimilating. And I think some of these things are so, like brain dead. If they're already gone, we wouldn't, if that's what you're asking.
So
No, that's okay.
your dad was getting some IV fluid, some basic routine run.
Electrolytes and stuff.
But I'm talking about TPN, because the implication I'm getting here is we must sustain life, okay, and that food and hydration are part of that. Well, if I can't use the gut for whatever reason, as a physician, I can order this total parenteral nutrition, which requires an IV. It's a very expensive way to feed somebody, but in essence, you can feed somebody and keep them alive.
Well, the thought would be is that they will eventually die of the disease that you're treating them for. But the other point that I think you're bringing that we didn't talk a lot about, and so it's a good question, is if it becomes such an extraordinary burden to do the treatment. And I was just reading about a case, there's a new stem cell, not embryonic, but a stem cell treatment to help with leukemia, but for one treatment it's $348,000. So suddenly it's gone beyond. That is such a financial burden that no one would have the expectation or really even the means to do that kind of treatment. So I think in the case, if it can be done inexpensively and not where it is harming the patient, then you would do everything possible.
Well, putting a feeding tube, there's some expense with that. There are complications from feeding tube. There are complications from the feeding, all of which are, accepted by many people. I can make the same arguments for, parenteral nutrition. And the cost, you cite this $300,000 for this one treatment. Well, what's your financial threshold for TPN?
And that's, again, another very personal question because, $348,000 for me is not even reasonable. But there might be someone else in here that even, $50,000 is unreasonable. You have to weigh the individual's financial burden. And this is where it gets very difficult. I will say the hardest part is on determining you're doing benefit and burden when it's the financial piece because, you have different extremes in the family. Some that say, I don't want any of Dad's money. I want all his money to go to his treatment, so I don't care. And others saying, he's dying for crying out loud. Why are we doing this X, Y, and Z? So you get a lot of emotion in here. And this is why writing down your desires, but it's kind of, and John Paul II has written on it, there's not been anything to write against, that we do everything that we can with the food and water unless it becomes, the body no longer assimilates or it becomes such a catastrophic financial burden on the family, and that's something that's very individual. I can't give you a number because it would differ from each one of you, and you've got to live with that decision. So you want to really think it through. You want to consult with other people.
So if you have insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, something, which will pay the bill up to a certain time. So now we're back to this patient is dying. They're 97 years old. Nobody lives forever. Or they're in their 70s or 60s and have a advanced cancer or something else. And we can keep them alive almost for as long as it takes until something happens.
And I would say, I just want to say one more thing with that, because it just hit me, is that certain things aren't even available. So even a particular treatment or even a certain way of getting hydration and fluids is not always available in every hospital.
It is here. Okay, we're talking about Charlotte, we're talking about South Carolina. I can't tell you about
another state, because I was thinking about, there's an act in Texas, and if some of you have a second home in Texas, I do firmly recommend that you get a healthcare power of attorney, because they have something called futile care, where the doctor can override. So you want to have your legal documents in order. But to my knowledge, and Father, if you know something else, I'm actually going further to get a doctorate in bioethics. So brain dead is one of my issues, but this could be another one. Food and hydration is that, to my knowledge, at this point, anything that I've read is that you go as long as it doesn't become a crushing financial burden on the family.
And And I think I just want to repeat what it is. We want the person to die from the illness. And so if nutrition hydration can be done and it's not a disproportionate burden, then you should do it. If it becomes that burden, then you don't do it. But we still want the individual to die from the disease. Or from old age, whatever it may be.
What about a DNR? How does the church feel about it?
So it all depends. It's all dependent on the circumstances. You could certainly have one, except a lot of people push DNRs a little too soon. We have something in this state which it's kind of like a DNR, right? POST is similar to that. Anybody heard of POST or PULST? POST or PULST, it's the acronym. Physician Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. It can kind of act like a DNR, and it is you refusing treatment, signing off that you don't want treatment, which would include, of course, it's a DNR as well. And so the problem with that is it doesn't allow you to do that benefit burden test, right? Situations arise. I go back to my grandmother as an example because it's so fresh in my mind. She had signed one in June, but people forgot she did. They forgot she signed it. So she ended up going to the hospital in October, received treatment, lived till April. So sometimes when you sign those things, she should have not received that treatment in October, according to the document she signed, but she did. But when you sign those things too early, you lose the opportunity for something that could prolong life, right? And all those extra months you have with your loved one, and she had all those extra months as well with her family. So DNRs are okay, but the benefit and burden of that situation is really important, and you don't want to sign it too soon.
I know that you all, the food I see in it, we want it to stay hot, so we're going to close. But I do want to say that the DNR just there are degrees of DNR, and you have to make sure that you have the one that, if you're really sincere about it and it's at the right time, that if you call 911 or if you call emergency, if you don't have the higher, there's 2 level 1 of the DNR, you have to get the one that is for all situations, because then they will treat you. If you call them in and you don't have the one that specifically says in any case, they will treat and do the full CPR.
Right.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. What'd you think about the morning session? Really good, huh? Yes, we're really blessed with the experts from the diocese and our own local expert, Father Kirby. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about very important things that I've noticed over the past year are topics that we should cover with our parishioners. So for those of you who may not know me as well, my name is Natalie Jackson. I'm the Director of Evangelization and Social Ministry at Our Lady of Grace, and I have the profound opportunity to serve our families when they are in need of the funeral liturgy. So I take care of our families for funeral planning, and I will say that I really, no problem, feel quite honored. And so in the last year, I noticed there are some pieces of information that I thought would be extremely helpful. So I gave you a good packet of paper, and I think it would be important to start off with the church's teaching on the burial of the deceased. And that is something that is beautifully articulated through the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. And that is the first document that is on that lovely stack of documents that I gave you. Okay, so the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith has helped us articulate the dignity of the body and how we treat the body after we have passed, and how we maintain the dignity of the body even in passing. So in life we are the Lord's, and in death we are the Lord's as well. So I was going to just go through this document and give you some highlights. And I would encourage everyone to read it in its entirety. It's a really beautiful document, and you can really see why the church teaches as it teaches. All right, so in the first paragraph, it says, all necessary measures must be taken to preserve the practice of reverently burying the faithful departed, adding, however, that cremation is not opposed per se to the Christian religion, and that no longer should the sacraments and funeral rites be denied to those who have asked that they be cremated. under the condition that this choice has not been made through a denial of Christian dogmas, the animosity of a secret society, or hatred of the Catholic religion and the church. So essentially it's saying the church used to teach that cremation was not something that we did. However, the church has allowed cremation. But the church has allowed cremation in her wisdom under certain conditions that continue to preserve the dignity of the person. Because after all, we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. So in the next paragraph, I just wanted to highlight the last two lines. Underlining the doctrinal and pastoral reasons for the preference of the burial of the remains of the faithful, and to set out norms pertaining to the conservation of ashes in the case of cremation. So that highlights that the church has allowed cremation, but it is still the priority of the church as the highest dignity to the body to bury versus cremate. However, cremation is definitely allowed. So I wanted to make that point. If you looked at what the church deems as the highest priority, the church wants to model Christ himself, who was in body when he passed, and then he was resurrected in body. So that's the first preference. Towards the bottom of the document, because of Christ, Christian death has a positive meaning. The Christian vision of death receives privileged expression in the liturgy of the church. Indeed, for your faithful, Lord, life is changed, not ended. And when this earthly dwelling turns to dust, an eternal dwelling is made ready for them in heaven. So following the ancient traditions of the church, and in memory of the death of our Lord and Savior, we hold the body in the highest of esteem. And you could see that just from our conversations this morning. So there are definitely opportunities to honor our loved ones in the form of cremation, and I want to talk about that a lot because there is a lot of, I receive a lot of questions on cremation. People know it's allowed, however, they may not necessarily know that there are certain conditions. So a few of the questions that I have been asked are, can we scatter ashes? And so in this document, I just point you to the document, and of course the church says, preserve the entire body in one resting place and in a public resting place. And the reason that we preserve our bodies in an urn, cremation, in a public place is because that gives the highest dignity to the body, and it also encourages us to keep the tradition of praying for the dead. When our loved ones are in our, say, our personal homes, that is a small circle that are going to pray for the dead. So the church says bring them out into a public consecrated so that the person can be prayed for as many times as possible. I don't know about you, but every time I pass a cemetery or a columbarium, I'm moved to prayer for the souls in that place. And so that's a wonderful tradition that the church has had up and down the ages, and we want to preserve that. Any questions so far? All right. So essentially, I ask you to read these 2 pages on your own prayerfully, and I just wanted to summarize some of the highlights. And the reason I say I ask you to read them on your own prayerfully is because that will help you in making final arrangements. When I do work with families, sometimes I receive requests to do things that are unfortunately not in communion with the teaching of the church. And many times it's just because people didn't know where to look for the information. So we want to give you as much information ahead of time so that you can make beautiful, prayerful decisions. And this particular document is your most helpful in making decisions for the body. Yes?
Before a person is cremated, should a priest be called to bless the body before it's cremated, or?
No, not necessarily.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Is there a Catholic cemetery here in town?
There is not a Catholic cemetery, however, and we will cover that in our next session. There is a cemetery. Can you refer? What is it? Yes. Yes. and we'll talk about that. Forest Lawn does have a Catholic prayer garden with a columbarium. So I was happy to hear that. I do know there are other cemeteries that have Catholic sections. Up north, you have totally Catholic cemeteries. I'm sure a lot of people know what I'm talking about. Here, it's a little different, but thankfully, more and more Catholics are moving here, and people have kindly been attentive to that. So there are several options, but the one that was mentioned is probably the best one. All right. Any other questions? Yes, Jeannie?
I think Penny was asking about, in most cases, probably 99% of them, the body has received the final blessing from the priest.
That's right. Prior to. That's right. Absolutely. Good point, Jeannie. So that blessing has been received, and then, of course, that blessing is again received in the funeral mass. Yes. Yes, sir.
I'm not sure if I'm right or not, but there is one diocesan cemetery down by Columbia somewhere, that person you just asked.
I'm not familiar with it, but I can look into it. Okay. And that question was nearby, and that's relative. Columbia is about an hour and a half away, which really isn't too bad at all. So I can look into that and certainly get that information. I, over the past year, have been compiling information on basically what the options are in the area for our parishioners. All right. So I started off with this document because it is most important, and it informs all the decision making that happens after a person has passed. So please do be attentive to that document. The other thing you have, your next page, is an overview of Catholic funeral rites. And this was taken from the USCCB, and it's a great summary of the Catholic funeral rite. And of course, it seems that it's changing over time. The Catholic teaching on the funeral has not changed, but what people would like to do with their funerals has changed. Back when I was young, and I'm older than I look, we had a vigil before the day before the funeral, so that people could visit the body, pay their last respects. They could reminisce. They could be there for each other. And now that cremation has become more prevalent, at least in our parish, I've noticed the trend that many people don't elect to have the vigil anymore. But it is still a wonderful opportunity, and many people still do have a vigil, because that is a time where additional prayer and in a more relaxed environment, people can celebrate the life of that person. What we have after the vigil, of course, is the funeral liturgy. There are three main reasons the funeral liturgy takes place, and it's not for the reason that people think. It's not necessarily to celebrate the life of the person. In life we are Christ's, in death we are Christ's. So we actually are focusing on Christ at the funeral liturgy. We're praying for the soul of the deceased so that they can be in full communion with God in heaven. We are consoling the family, and we're celebrating Christ's victory over death. Those are three main points to share with you. So those three items are key in the planning process. And then, of course, the rite of committal. Many times we get the opportunity to do that right here at Our Lady of Grace at the columbarium. So we have our funeral mass, and we process down, and we lay our loved ones to rest in the columbarium. And then, of course, sometimes we go out to the cemetery and do that as well. But the rite of committal is the third portion of the Christian funeral. And so I wanted to just share those with you as well. And this is information that I share with individuals that come in to see me for funeral planning. But oftentimes I feel it's too late. So a lot of times people will come in and they'll kind of know what they want to do already. And so again, this is another document that's kind of helpful in helping you develop your thought process around final arrangements pertaining to the liturgy and rite of committal. All right. Now I just wanted to walk you through some of the planning documents that are used here at Our Lady of Grace to facilitate a funeral. And the reason I'm giving you these planning documents is because you can see what you or a loved one will be asked when the time comes and we're making those plans to put together a beautiful funeral liturgy. So I just wanted to share those with you. Oftentimes, and actually most of the time, I will receive a call from the funeral home in tandem with the family, or the funeral home is actually with the family at that time, and we begin the process there. And I usually do a personal meeting with each family member that's making the final arrangements for the liturgy. So I'm not going to go over every question we ask, but I want to give you an idea of the type of things that we are needing to know behind the scenes here at Our Lady of Grace so that we can put together the funeral liturgy. Okay? Something that's really important that I wanted to share with everyone too that I find is helpful is actually a visual. So I brought a prop today, and it's more than a prop. It's a wonderful book called The Order of Christian Funerals. This is the book that the church uses to help us with the funeral liturgy. This is the guidance for the funeral liturgy. And so with that guidance comes choices, but limited choices, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So your next page, you have funeral and memorial mass readings as prescribed by the Order of Christian Funerals. Many people have their favorite Bible verses. I bet I could go around and each person would say, what their favorite Bible verse is, and that touches their heart. And so, so too, the church has their favorite Bible verses, but the most fitting Bible verses that the magisterium has said should be used in a funeral liturgy. So I have given you a copy of all of the readings that are prescribed through the rite of Christian funerals that can be chosen. So some people think, well, I can just choose one that I like. But actually, the church asks that you choose from among a number of choices. And there may be some discretion built in there, but I'm speaking in general terms. The rite of Christian burial informs the readings that you're allowed to use in the funeral mass. A lot of people don't know that, but now all the people in here know that, which is really helpful. And they're beautiful in their meaning, and there's so much wisdom that our church leaders have that we don't. And we trust the church because this is Christ's church, and they've said these are the most fitting. So in the church's generosity, you do have a lot of choices for the first reading, the responsorial psalm, the second reading, and the gospel. So what's really great is that helps you to plan ahead. One thing that in helping families with planning funerals, that is, it is an honor that I am able to impart some of this information to people. But sometimes that could be upsetting because they do come in and they have these readings that they want to do. And then I say, well, here are the readings you can choose from. So as compassionately as possible, I like to get those readings out ahead of time. So there you have all of them. After that page, well, after several pages, I have a listing of sacred music for funerals at Our Lady of Grace. And again, the music is informed by the church. However, there is some discretion that the pastor can use. And I will tell you, I'm always in consultation with Father Kirby. So even today, you're probably going to ask me questions, and I'm going to say, I need to talk to Father Kirby, because he is our resident expert, as he should be. So I do get all kinds of questions, and just like in the military, I say, sir, I do not know, but I will find out. The main thing is that we want to make sure we give the right information. So any questions that are asked today that I don't know, I'll just simply tell you, I'll let you know. But the sacred music is informed by the Order of Christian Funerals, And it also reflects what we are able to do musically here. You know, we have a wonderful music team, and they have the ability to sing and play music. However, I will say special requests, again, there is some discretion that Father Kirby can use. So I wanted to just kind of let you know that too. The next page is a funeral planning sheet. I've actually had some parishioners come meet with me, and they wanted to pre-plan their funeral liturgy. So I think that's a wonderful act of compassion for their family members who will plan their funeral. And so we know exactly what they wanted. There's no guesswork. We know the first reading that they wanted, the second reading, the music. It's a really beautiful thing to do. So I'm very happy to meet with anyone that's interested in pre-planning the funeral liturgy. And then the sheet that you have in there can be the starting point. So you can put down what your first reading selection is, who you would like to read it. The nice thing about the funeral mass too is that we are able to involve families. So a grandson or a daughter or a spouse can be a lector. And so please be thinking about that too. Who would I want to be a part of the funeral mass? And then you can put all of that down. Let us know what music you would like. And then, of course, gift bearers. That's another nice way for family members to be involved. And then, of course, words of remembrance. So we are often asked about eulogies. And there is some discretion with that. And there, at Our Lady of Grace, Father Kirby has directed that we are able to give words of remembrance before the Mass. And it's about 5 minutes. Now, we know that we want to speak usually longer than 5 minutes. So the encouragement is to spend that additional time at the vigil, where a person can speak for as long as they want. And then also at funeral receptions, people are able to spend a lot of time. Pat Cassetta, for those of you who are friends with Pat, his daughter did a really wonderful job of honoring her dad at their reception. But again, we're glorifying God, we're praying for the family, and we are glorifying God, celebrating his triumph over death, okay? And with that, we also want to make sure that we give people an opportunity to say some specific words about their loved ones. Okay, and then also the last sheet is in any parish that you go to, there is remuneration for funerals. Now, certainly if there's a family that cannot donate to the church, they're going to still have a beautiful funeral. But the church does ask for assistance with funeral remuneration, and I wanted to give you that sheet just to give you kind of an idea of what those amounts would be. We have a phenomenal funeral hospitality team, just a phenomenal hospitality team in general. And they are always on point for a funeral. So if a family would like to have a funeral right here in the parish hall, then we have teams that are ready at almost a moment's notice to put together just a really lovely reception for the family. And so I wanted to make note of that, and that's in some of those planning documents that I gave you. Any questions?
Yeah, Penny. I spoke to Paul, though I guess he's not here, but I thought maybe everybody else might want to hear this. He had said that either the cremains or the body in the casket should be intact.
Yes.
But I asked him about supposing you want to donate organs. Mm-hmm. If you donate organs, then your body is not intact, right. And he said not a problem.
Exactly.
To be able to donate organs. So.
Did everyone hear that? Yes, anyone didn't? Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, because that is a really important question. So the church's preference obviously is the burial of the body. The church's second preference is that the body be present at the Mass and then cremated after. The church's third preference is cremation, remains at the Mass. What's most important to note is where your heart is on that.
Yes.
What is the what about the casket? My My grandfather, the grandfather of my grandchildren just died, and they just freaked out with the casket. Really bothered them. And I'm just wondering if they do that.
Well, I'll tell you what we here locally do is we do not feel we can do an open casket here at Our Lady of Grace. And it's because of the construction of the building. We had one funeral that way, and we did not feel, after evaluating, that we could really give the entire dignity that we needed to the person and their family, because you have the practical matters that come after with closing of the casket and whatnot. And as you know, our church is a fishbowl. There are windows everywhere. There's just not a lot of room for discretion because it's so open, which is a blessing and a good thing to be open. But when it comes to a funeral, locally, we don't feel we can do it in this current facility.
They used to always say that that was the way to have closure, but that's not a thought anymore.
I honestly don't know of any particular teaching on that, but I will write it down in case I come across any further information, and then I will let you know. Yeah, the vigil is often the place that there's the open casket, and usually that's the day before the morning of, so I do know that much. Yes?
Wouldn't you do the vigil at the funeral home and have an open casket
Yep.
before the cremation?
People have done that. Yes. So they want to give people the opportunity to pay their last respects. A lot of people, they can do that at the funeral home, and I think that Robin will probably be able to articulate it better than me. But yes, people definitely take that time and opportunity at vigils.
Okay, what I was thinking of mostly is just the immediate family. For that, would Father come to the funeral home for the final blessing before cremation?
Father Kirby has, usually a deacon will come to the funeral home, but Father Kirby in some instances would come too. But we usually try to send somebody to that vigil. Any other questions?
Just curious, how far is Father Kirby or somebody willing to travel? Because I have mine set up already, I've already paid for it through, and I'm getting sent back to New York to a VA secretary.
Wow.
So, I would prefer having somebody from the parish there, but, obviously, it's gonna be determined by them.
That would have to be something I'd ask Father Kirby. But I'll let him know that has been asked, because you know what? That might be the first time he's ever been asked that. So he may not have formulated a thought on that. My guess, though, is he may refer to a local priest in that matter, although his heart would be with you, I'm sure. That's awesome. Well, our priests are awesome. Yes, ma'am. Oh, the question was, how far is Father Kirby willing to travel to lay us to rest? Because we all love him and we want him to be with us wherever our final resting place is. And I'd say we'd have to ask Father Kirby about that. Yeah. So I've briefly gone through everything. Everything is so much more rich and deep than what I've now covered. But I think the goal, at least for me today in service to you, is to make you aware of some resources that you may or may not have been aware of before. The church is not an entity that just makes up rules for no reason. So we know that, and it's really wonderful to be able to know where you can get that information and pass it on to your loved ones who will be making arrangements for you, or use it yourself in making arrangements for a loved one. So most importantly, it's just getting that information out to you. And again, it's an incredible honor to minister to families at that time. I'm certainly happy to meet with anyone who's interested in pre-planning or has further questions. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Robin Barron. Robin is from Heritage Funeral Home. We've worked with Robin and her team many times. Very compassionate, professional group over there. And she's going to speak with you about some of the more practical matters of pre-planning. And so she also has some folders that are going to be passed out that'll help you also. And just we want to load you down with good information. So we'll just be a moment, and then Robin will be up here. But thank you for coming today. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Robin Barron. Are you guys able to hear me clearly? Because I have the tendency to mumble, as my mom would say. I'm with Heritage Funeral Home, and we have a couple different locations. I have a beautiful assistant that's passing out some folders. And what I'm going to do is just start from the beginning and go through a lot of things. How many people have their arrangements already arranged with a funeral home? How many of you know what you want to have done, burial or cremation? Y'all pretty much know what you want, but the people that wrote it down, you've got it written down. The rest of you, this is the next educational part of living with our liturgy and proceeding on with our funeral rites and passages. The folder that you're going to be getting has a bunch of information. But what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about what we do and what is anticipated on a funeral home standpoint. Just a little bit about myself. My name's Robin. I'm from Pittsburgh, transferred to Vienna, Virginia, and now I call North Carolina Indian Trail my home. And I don't plan on going back because of the snow. And I know there's some transplants from Pittsburgh. It's a small world, it really is. One of the things that we talk about is we plan for a lot of things. We plan for our education, our children's education. We plan for marriage, family, retirement. It's time to do the next thing is, why are we not planning for our funerals? But what about the final event, your journey? And that's death. Now, there's two things that we all go through, and we all have taxes and death, right? Those are the two biggest things. But one of the things that you want to make sure your family and friends know what your plans are. It's always good to communicate, but writing it down, that's one of the biggest things. Spare your family the burden of making those decisions for you. One of the things that we talk about is how much a funeral can cost. And in the packet that I gave you, it goes about the pricing and things like that. I won't go over a lot of that. That's for you to take, look at it. But one of the things that we encourage is to relieve your family of that financial burden. It may be burials anywhere from $7,000 and go up from there. Cremation, you can have a very simple cremation at $1,500 and it goes up from there as well. But as far as the families, when I meet with a family that hasn't pre-planned or pre-arranged and they have no idea what mom wanted or dad wanted, they tend to overspend. And it's our job to educate them so they can make good decisions for themselves. And the thing with, they like this, mom's worth more than the more economical casket, so they tend to spend a little bit more, and really they don't have to. If you pick out your own things, then you've already alleviated those pressures from your family from making those decisions. Now, there's a couple different types of funeral homes, funeral service providers. There's independent funeral homes. Heritage Funeral Home is an independent funeral home. We're independently owned and operated. My boss works out of and he's the owner, he works out of our Weddington Matthews office. We own and operate our own crematory, and we can have our visitations and services, visitations at the funeral home, service masses here at the church. And that's the vigil Natalie was talking about. The other types of funeral service providers are your corporate businesses. Those are the people that have like the SCI or Dignity. A lot of them are owned by corporations and most often headquartered out of state. And what happens is when someone passes away, their removals are done by a third party. But somebody ultimately, you would be making it back to the funeral home that you choose. And the third type of funeral service provider is a licensee. Now what that means is they don't have a funeral home, they don't have any overhead, you don't know where your loved one's going. So those are the questions that you want to ask for those individuals that don't have a business, because in North and South Carolina, you don't have to if you didn't want to. One of the things that we encourage you to do is know who you're working with. And that's one of the big things. Now at Our Lady of Grace, I know that there are some different types of services. We've had traditional cremations where we would have the vigil at the funeral home, brought their loved one to the church for the mass, and then after that, instead of going to a cemetery, we would take the loved one back to our crematory, conduct the cremation, and return the cremated remains either to the church, to the cemetery, or have the final place of disposition already selected. Some of that when I heard the casket being open, typically the casket's open at the funeral home and not at the church. If you chose cremation and your loved one didn't want anyone to do a viewing, there's certain options for that as well where you don't have to. And if your loved ones, your immediate family members wanted to view you, that's certainly possible. We make that happen. We do things differently. Yes, ma'am.
If you wanted to view the body, does it have to be embalmed before you view it if you were going to cremate or not?
That's a good question. Embalming is not a law. It is not. If you were planning on having a public viewing where the individual is dressed and placed in a casket for the public to view, we at the funeral home recommend embalming. Now, if it's just immediate family members, no. Just as long as it's immediate family members, and as far as natural preservation, let's just say. But yes and no. You don't have to be embalmed, but yes, we would recommend it. There's no law for that. Okay? One of the things that you would want to write down is whether or not you want to be buried or if you wanted to be cremated. One of those things, if you communicate that and you put it in writing, make a little note somewhere, guess what? That document does not cover us, the authority, or any crematory operator, the authority to conduct a cremation. Each crematory has our own special cremation authorization that needs to be either signed by you or the majority of your family members or your next of kin. Now, with cremation, how many people are going to be cremated? Wow. That is the whole room. So there's a lot more information that I could provide to you about cremation, but I'm just going to kind of go over with what we plan to talk about and kind of talk a little bit more about cremation, if that's okay with the church. Now, as far as writing things down and keeping your family in the loop, that is a good thing. But the ultimate goal would be to talk to your funeral home, talk to your funeral director, write it down, have the funeral home have it on record. Yes, you can sign your own cremation authorization. Yes, you can complete your own worksheet at the funeral home. It doesn't cost you a dime to do that. You can save your family the stress of signing that. Say, for example, we could talk about my dad. My dad was in Pittsburgh when he passed away. I have two brothers, Air Force. One was out of the country, and I have a sister in Pittsburgh, another brother in Harrisburg. So when he passed away, a lot of the questions was, well, we know Dad wanted to be cremated. How are we going to get this done? I said, Dad already signed his paperwork. He had me mad. We were at a funeral. It was a vigil. And we were at this funeral home for the vigil in Pennsylvania, and we were talking about cremation, and my dad said, well, I want to be cremated. And I said, well, what do you want done with your cremated remains? He said, just put me anywhere. I don't care, honey. How many times have you heard that? Let me tell you, you talk to a funeral director as your child, that will only inflame the conversation. Because funerals are for the living and for our deceased, but ultimately, this is someone that gave us life, someone that we love and adore. No, we're just not going to do nothing with them. So I took my dad, went into an office, and I asked the director there, and I said, I'm not licensed in Pennsylvania. Can I have one of your authorizations for cremation? We sat down, completed that paperwork, and I said, just keep it on file just in case. Either he's going to walk out of here or we're going to have you carry him back to the crematory. But that's all fun. But years later, when he did pass away and those questions were asked, that document was already signed. His death certificate worksheet was completed. His mother's maiden name. How many of your children or your grandchildren know your mother's maiden name? All that information is completed on those death certificates. I didn't know my dad only had one L in Wendell. I thought there was always two. He set the record straight for us. His name would have been spelled wrong on his death certificate if it was left to me. In the packets that you have, it talks about the information for the death certificate. Retirement is not an occupation. It might be for some, but on most of those documents, they want to know what your occupation was prior to your retirement. But we do know retirement, you are a lot busier now. Grandchildren, different events. I know, I'm seeing the heads nodding. One of the things that, no, getting back on, that was me chasing a squirrel, but talking about writing your wishes down and getting them written down. It didn't cost my dad a dime to do that. It just took him time to fill out the paperwork, and that just saved us so much. And I'm so thankful that he at least let me give that gift to us as kids, because at that point in time, we needed to be together as family and not wonder how we're going to get these paperworks completed. Because once he left the hospice facility, the cremation was taking place a day or two later, and he was in our care. I didn't see the funeral director. It was all done through our Veterans Council, and we had him brought here to be buried at Forest Lawn East Cemetery. Getting back to as far as what your services are, cremation, what your plans are for your cremated remains, you can control how much you're spending now. What are your kids going to do with your life insurance money? Are they going to use it to help your other spouse live? Survive. That's what life insurances are for. If you wanted to, you can prepay for your services, write that down, meet with your funeral home. There are documents that can be completed to save your children from having to pay for those expenses. We would work closely with the church in order to tell them what has been planned, and the next step would be, if you haven't done so, meet with Natalie or someone at the church in order to complete your liturgy and those readings. If you wanted flowers to be brought to the church. Now, I'm not a flower person. I would be mad if somebody sent flowers for me. So I would want somebody to do something special instead of sending flowers. Write it down. Write it down. If you want, you can have in lieu of flowers donations to be made to your church or one of the different avenues within your church to have those funds help your funeral family and friends here instead of spending money on flowers. But flowers are beautiful, and again, it's what you pay for them. And if you wanted to select something, you can certainly do that and or not. The death certificate worksheet that you have in your folder, if you want to, you can go ahead and take the time to fill that out at home, or if you wanted to meet with a funeral director at our funeral home, you can, or reach out to the funeral home that you've worked with in the past. Certainly, if you're not tied with a funeral home, we'd be honored and blessed to help you. And as far as making your arrangements, write it down. Where do you keep your important documents? You keep them in a safety deposit box or in a fire safe that has a nice little key to it? If you write your things down and put it in there, and your kids don't know where the key is or the combination, I have had it where families would say, Mom has it written down, the paperwork's on file, it's in the bank safety deposit box. Guess what? You can't get to that safety deposit box. unless you are on the safety deposit box. Write it down and give it to your funeral director. That's the best thing that you can do for your kids. And especially cremation, the majority of you guys are planning to be cremated. If you wanted to prepay for your services, there's a couple different ways that could be paid for. You can do a trust or a life insurance policy, or you can prepay through a funeral home, and most of those can be what's called inflation proof. That means you're paying for your services today for tomorrow's use, and the price should not change. And that's one of the biggest things that we try to recommend families is if you prepaid for it, your cremation's not going to go up. Your price shouldn't go up. The only thing that you may be responsible for would be cash advance items. Now, cash advance items are things that a funeral home or funeral director would have to purchase for you for your family's service, like death certificates. South Carolina, the death certificates are $12 each for the first one, $3 each for each additional. And if you pass away over just a stone's throw over in North Carolina, they're $10 each. So that is what's considered a cash advance item. If you wanted to have an obituary for a newspaper, we help write those, and we would submit them to the newspaper or put it free on our website or send it to whomever for an out-of-town newspaper. How many people are from South Carolina in this area? Hey. Oh, you're not from here? So, no, but who is actually born and raised in this area? Oh my goodness, I could hear a pin drop. So we're a bunch of transplants. But if you, as far as out-of-town newspapers, let's just go on that. You're born and raised in another city, and your career was there, and you decided to move south and leave your snowblower on the curb and come down south and enjoy the weather. We can help put an obituary in that newspaper for you. Now, one of the things that I say about out-of-town newspapers, whatever they charge is what you'll be charged. We are the mediator for those out-of-town newspapers, and that's considered a cash advance item. No, we don't know what the cost will be until it's published, but if you wanted to prepay or put some money into this account for that to help offset the expenses for an obituary, that's an avenue that you can do too. But that's the items that I cannot guarantee the price won't change. Yes, sir?
It's a very basic question about death certificates and copies of death certificates.
Yes, sir.
Can you just Xerox off the original, or do you have to have a death certificate?
That's a good question. The question is, do you need to have certified copies, or can you just make a photocopy of the death certificate? Death certificates are used to close out accounts or have your name removed from an account. So they need originals. They need to have that raised seal on that document. Those are the certified copies, and those are issued by the county. We as a funeral home would file the death certificate and pick up those certified copies for your family. But everyone's different. When we sit, in general, I've seen anywhere from 5 to 10. Just recently, 1. If you are moved into a nursing home and you have to spend down, that means you're not allowed to have any money in your account but $2,000. You just might only need 1 certified death certificate. Each family is unique in that question, sir. So if you have a house, you'll need 1 for that. A car, even if both parents or you and your spouse is on the title for that vehicle, in order to have their name removed from it, typically you have to sign it or somebody has to sign it. Well, the deceased is no longer there to sign it. That document is in place of his signature. Like an insurance company, they need an original. The vehicles, the house, life insurance. Life insurances, they want the original. There are some companies out there that just will accept a fax or a photocopy from the funeral home. But if you go somewhere and you show them the original, would you mind making a copy of it and giving it back to me? Because I'm paying for that. If you ask, most of the time they may say yes, but if you don't ask the question, guess what? The answer is always going to be no. So yes, you are paying for those certified copies. Most of these companies want the originals. Now for credit card companies, no, they don't typically need a certified copy. Half the time they don't even need a copy of the death certificate, just a simple phone call. Now, as far as Social Security, do they need a death certificate? Most of the times, no, because what we do, we submit a notification to Social Security, let them know that the death has occurred, and we recommend that the living spouse would call and follow up with Social Security to get your big $255 check. And that is a one-time per couple. So say, for example, one time, listen, if you are your husband and wife, your husband passes away, you receive the death benefit. You pass away, there's no more money. That is it. If you have a child under the age of 18, there may be benefits payable. If you have a dependent child or an adult child that's dependent, they may be able to receive some money. But it is a one-time per couple deal unless you remarry and then you get that, you can get those funds. But it is a one-time deal, unfortunately. Yes, sir. I'm going to plead the fifth on that one. I did open that up. I'm sorry, or am I? I don't know.
My question is that my understanding is I will be transported out of state, right? We did come from New York, and we have a cemetery plot back there at Capital Cemetery. My question is, and it's a twofold question, Natalie's still here because I didn't even ask her this. Now, my understanding is if the body is going to be transferred, it has to be transferred from one funeral home to another funeral home.
That is correct.
Okay. If the ashes, if you get cremated, can my wife take my ashes out of state and go up to New York?
The question was, can cremated remains be transferred out of state? Now, by another family member. I'm going to address that in a couple different ways. The answer is yes. A family member can carry cremated remains out of state. Now, going to New York for burial, your cemetery may require documentation proving that you have, those are the cremated remains. Now, when we conduct a cremation at our funeral home, we issue a document, it's called a certificate of cremation. That document would accompany those cremated remains, be it that your family carries them or we ship them. Now, if we were to ship them, we do not use FedEx, UPS, DHL, because you have to be able to put a price tag on something. You have to put a price for insurance purposes, and guess what? You are priceless. You can't. So what happens is when we ship or mail cremated remains, we have to send them registered mail, return receipt. So everywhere your cremated remains stop along the way, there's documentation. That process does take a couple days. So if you're planning a funeral, your family's doing your funeral tomorrow and you want us to mail them today, I can guarantee it, you'll be late for your funeral. We try not to do that, but we try to educate our family so you can make some really good decisions. Now, the airlines, this is the other part, the airlines. Okay, so your family's going to be taking your cremated remains through the airport. With our TSA, oh my goodness. Let me tell you, one of the things that what we do and recommend, once we conduct a cremation, we place those cremated remains in a plastic bag, in a plastic box, in a cardboard box, and we wrap that box. You can place that in a bag or carry-on. Once you get to the TSA agent, now I know this from firsthand because we'd taken and scattered cremated remains out of state in Hawaii, and I was nervous because I've always told people how to do it, but never experienced it myself. So when I went to the TSA agent, they pulled out, and I said, I have cremated remains. What do I do? And he said, place them, I'm going to get you a different bin. So he pulls out a different bin, and it doesn't look like the other bins that we put our shoes in. So I'm assuming that this is a respectful bin, that they just don't put regular stuff in. They take the cremated remains. I placed them in that bin. They went through the x-ray. Now, all the documents that came with the cremated remains were accompanying. And I showed that to the TSA agent. I said, these are cremated remains. Here's the certificate. Went through the x-ray, and I'm expecting to hear bells and whistles because there's a metal disc in there indicating who is there and all the documentation supporting. I go through, and they said, here you go. Thank you. I'm sorry for your loss. I said, that's it? No frisk? Nothing. But they handled it with tact and respect and dignity. And that gave me, I was pretty taken back. And I think of some of these TSA agents, how many of you gone through the airport and they have to give you a pat down because there's a warm spot or, yes, I've had that, but not this time, which was I was surprised. And with that being said, they were very respectful. They knew.
You know, they knew that this individual was making their way home. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just thinking, if I had go with cremation, which I'm doubting, I don't know, mine would have to be interred into, I have already a crypt with my husband. They're in Florida. Could it be sent alone, without anyone, like we say shipped? And then what happens if it's sent alone and there's no one in Florida to accept it but the cemetery?
Okay, I'll address that. I'm going to repeat that question so everyone can hear. She was planning on possibly burying cremated remains, her cremated remains in Florida, but there wasn't a family member that would be accompanying or a family member to receive or be at the cemetery for the interment. Typically, what we would do is we would communicate with the cemetery, talk to the cemetery representative, and make arrangements to have those cremated remains shipped to that individual at the cemetery with the whatever it is that you documented. Because on our cremation authorization, you can dictate what happens to your cremated remains. Most of them are inurned at a church columbarium, in a cemetery, or my dad, he didn't care. We originally was going to take him to Arlington National. Now, Arlington National will not accept cremated remains by mail. They have to be physically taken to the cemetery. That's the only caveat to that, because Arlington is such a big cemetery. It's so busy, and they just can't keep up with. So they have to have a physical person to deliver them to the cemetery, where we'd have to acquire a funeral director in that area to transport them, or an agent or a family member to take them directly to the cemetery. I answered your question, didn't I? Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Question. We're going this way.
Natalie.
Me? No.
Natalie.
Natalie said that it is preferable that the body be in the church for the funeral mass.
Mm-hmm.
How does this work with cremation? Do you buy a casket and also you pay for cremation here? In other words, this could be an expensive funeral, and does it need to be?
Okay, I'll address that. And her question was, the church requires to have the body present for a mass. Now, cremated remains and an urn as a whole is a body. So you don't have to purchase a casket. So as long as the cremated remains are together in an urn in one vessel, that's a body. And it's either that or a body in a casket. Did I answer your question?
Can you, she's asking, you're gonna have the body, can you rent a casket for
Yes.
the funeral? Can you explain that?
Mm-hmm. Now, in your packet, if you pull out the paper that has, it says our general price list. I'm sorry, I moved away. Our general price list. If you open up your page, booklet to page number 6. Do you have one, Nellie? On page 6, that is our traditional cremation. There's different types of services that can be provided. You can have a casket with your body and have a vigil with a casket open at the funeral home. With that particular package, that includes us picking you up, bringing you back to our funeral home, filing the death certificate in the county or state that you pass away in. That includes a register book, prayer cards for your service. We would help write your obituary, things like that. That's your basic traditional ceremony. Now, yes, ma'am?
You need to be involved. Say you want to have a private private family viewing, and then bring the body to the church. So you wouldn't have to be embalmed to bring the body to the church?
To bring the body to the church, yes, we recommend that the remains be embalmed.
But even if you were going to be cremated?
Even if you were going to be cremated, if we are placing your body in the casket for public service. If it's going to be a service or prayers with the body, let me just back that up. With embalming, let me explain what embalming is. It's a temporary preservation and disinfection of the human remains. And with that being said, if we bring remains into a facility that are not embalmed, there's no delicate way to put it, that there may be odors. So that is why we recommend to save from any type of embarrassment, anything like that. But if we are having a family viewing at the funeral home and it's just the family members, it's okay. You don't have to be embalmed. Once we move that to a public viewing or a public ceremony, then that's where we recommend. Did that answer your question even better? Okay. Now, as far as what we do with our packages on that traditional cremation, your body would be at the funeral home. We usually do a visitation for 2 hours, and that's what's included in there. How many of you are used to a 2 to 4, 7 to 9 for 2 or 3 days, or a 1 to 9 visitation? Well, welcome to the South. Things are a little bit different, but we do aim to help our families to keep with their traditions. But yes, yes, sir.
It's all right, continue. I just want to verify what I'm understanding of this lady over here asking the question. So if I want to be cremated, or I do want to come to the church as my body, I am renting a casket?
Yes, that is that traditional cremation package that you see there. That includes the embalming. That includes the use of a rental casket. Now, let me describe that rental casket for you. It is a solid oak casket. It's very beautiful. If families were using that particular type of casket for burial, they're paying about $3,000 for that particular casket for burial. When we use it for our cremation, our rental services, what we do is there's an insert inside that casket. Now, if you don't tell anybody that you're going to be cremated, you don't have to. We don't tell if you don't want us to, but that's how nice that casket is. Once the services are over, there's a way that we can remove that insert without disturbing the body. But we do remove the body with that insert, and then that is what you're cremated in. And so as far as the embalming, yes, the rental casket, we have a package that includes that. Now, if you wanted to add hours to visitation, we can certainly accommodate that. I've been meeting with families for such a long time now, having the 2 to 4, 7 to 9 for multiple days, that's hard on a family. That is really hard. It really is. So in the past, what I've seen a lot would be something from 6 to 8 the night before, and then the mass taking place the following day at the church. But when we get to the church, the casket's closed. And we don't open it again in front of the family. And then once we arrive here at the church, a pall is placed over the casket, and then the ceremony is done. After we depart and go to the coach, the hearse, we can use pallbearers. So you can still have that more traditional feel to a service, but not go to a cemetery. And as far as in earning in a columbarium, we would bring the cremated remains back to the church. We could set up a time, have an inurnment ceremony. It could be private with family members only, or if you wanted it public or invite people, that's personal choice. It really is. I've seen it where we've had military honors being performed at a columbarium as well. There's nothing more moving than having a veteran honored. How many of you guys are veterans? I heard a veteran cemetery. Okay. So there's a veteran cemetery in Columbia. There's one in Salisbury. And there's Arlington National. And if you're veteran, you earn the right to be buried or inurned at a national cemetery too. Okay? There's no charges for that for you, but the lack of understanding with a veteran, they think that everything is paid for by the veterans, and that's not the case. The veterans, being a veteran, and we thank you for your service, you get a flag, you get the niche at the columbarium, the opening and closing at the columbarium, and the military honors. Depending on which cemetery you choose, it may be just 2 active duty servicemen or women come to fold the flag and present the flag and play taps. That's it. Arlington National, they will do the same thing. You get a little bit more detail with that. But as far as what you expect to get from the veterans, it's very little, very little. But if you did that at a national cemetery, certainly there's a little bit more coverage than if you were purchasing a niche at Forest Lawn East. But we always recommend your church columbarium. Yes, sir.
Practical matter, if you buy a package ahead of time, you prepay all this stuff, and for some reason you have to go somewhere else to do your turn.
Okay. The question was if you prepaid a service and you decide to move. Now, if you prepay for a service, what we would do is those funds, there's paperwork involved that we would have to do. There's notification of the state board. I'm based out of North Carolina, just across the border in Ballantyne. We have to notify the North Carolina Board of Funeral Service. The reason for that is if you did decide to move, there's communication. Your kids forget where you paid for your services, but first of all, there's tracking. If they knew that you paid for your services at a funeral home, that's one way of finding out where it is. The second is what state. They would tell you, okay, so it's at North Carolina. They would be able to tell you where your money is, because this is what you're trying to make sure that everybody knows is where's your money. When somebody comes in and prepays for a funeral expense, it's not paid directly to the funeral home. And that's where some funeral homes get in trouble, is they put it in their operating account instead of a trust or an insurance somewhere else other than the funeral home's money. So say, for example, you move out of state. Now, being that we're family owned and operated, we don't have another funeral home out of state. And what we do is we recommend that your family members find a funeral home, preferably an independent or family-owned funeral home. Most of those funeral homes would accept those funds as payment in full and honor the same contracts, but they don't have to. If they do, that is perfect. If they don't, then you say, who will? And then you can call another family funeral home. But my past experience, so most of the companies do honor. And I know that once we've gotten services transferred to us from other states, we've honored those as payment in full. And sometimes these other agencies where they prepaid for their services and then they come to us, we're writing refund checks. So that money would go back to the estate of whomever it was that passed away. So that's what would happen with the excess money, if there is any. Yes, ma'am.
I happen to contract with Dignity, and what I found was that they're national, basically. So all I had to do was call them when I left Illinois, and I did find the one right up here in North Carolina. So that just got transferred.
That's an easy transfer. That is through those corporate funeral homes that are national. Like I said, we are family owned, but as far as the expense of what you paid from there to there, you can compare prices. If you wanted to, you can do that. But I know that there's many great funeral homes. Yes, sir.
I'm going to try to make this my last question. It says here, right, for you, Heritage, which I want to say you did a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
But it just says here that you will pick up the body, right, only from Union and Mecklenburg County. What happens to my body if I'm over here in Lancaster?
It's a 30-mile radius, and the price list I know, but it is a 30-mile radius, and that we go through. If you are beyond 30 miles from our funeral home, because I think here we're like 6 miles, if you live in this area, that's still covered in that removal fee. And it's a 30-mile from our location in Ballantyne. But you're allowed to ask more questions if you want. Yes, ma'am. We're located at Hunter's Crossing. Our chapel there is in a shopping center. It's more of a contemporary facility versus our more traditional funeral home in Weddington and in Weddington Matthews and our Indian Trail office. Those are the two more traditional view of a funeral home. My location in Ballantyne is a smaller location. It's more intimate. We find that families just don't want to step foot into a funeral home, and that's okay. So this meets their wishes. And yes, we do have a chapel there. Most of our visitations, viewings, if you are having a larger service, we would recommend one of our other locations. But if it's a smaller group of people that you're expecting, then our Valentine office is perfect for you. Yes, ma'am.
I have gone through the process, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, and I came from a funeral home background, and I recommend everyone have this done for your family's sake. What Mallory presented, to have all this done and out of the way, it's like, it's a burden off your back. I mean, my children don't have to figure out what do they want, what do they want.
Exactly. And where do you want your cremated remains to go? Would you be opposed to having a more traditional service with your body in a casket? My mom would haunt me if I had her casket open. You've got to write it down. Meet with your funeral director. There's the cremation authorization. You might want to check to make sure you're going to be cremated or buried. Okay, so you're good. Some cremations from one agency to another, I know that we have a unique cremation authorization. Each crematory has their own authorization. Being that we own and operate our own crematory, I am a crematory operator. I've gone to people's homes, brought them back. You know who you're having coming to your home. You know where they're going. You know where the cremation is going to be taking place. You're not going to be sent out to another agency for cremation. So if you're calling around asking prices and comparing, ask them if they own and operate their own crematory. Ask those questions. There's a couple different agencies out there that do cremations for a low cost. Ask your questions, be an educated consumer, and that's my best advice that I can share with you. As far as cremation, sign your own cremation authorization. Fill out that death certificate worksheet at your funeral home. If you want to meet with me or want to take the time to fill it out, I can stick around for a little bit, or we can set a time to come to the funeral home. I have some information and some giveaways at the side over there, and if you want me to reach out to you to set up a time, put your name, your number. I am very pressure-free when it comes to making these choices, because this is something that we can help you with. And to sit down and talk to us, it doesn't cost you anything. And what we would do is we can talk to you further about cremation, and perhaps at some other time, at a later date, I can go into further detail about the actual act of cremation, because that's a whole ceremony in itself that I can talk about, a whole seminar.
One thing about the columbarium, we're planning November 2nd, which is All Souls Day. And we have our grief support group that we've just started at Our Lady of Grace, and it is really a beautiful thing. And we're talking about all of us going together to the columbarium for Mass. and their loved ones are going to be right there. And how special is that? How much dignity to have the holy sacrifice of the Mass right there in front of the columbarium. Again, that document is so beautiful. There's not really anything left to question on it. However, and I'll close with remarks after Robin's done, but we're a resource. So anybody that wants to come talk to Father or myself, we're going to get you the best possible answers. But not everything's cut and dry. So we look to the church for its guidance so we can give you good answers. So I hope that was helpful.
You have more questions?
Yes, one for me. Okay. I'll try to answer it.
Before about carrying the remains of ashes out of state, okay? What is the Catholic Church? You know, we will be bringing these ashes to a Catholic cemetery on Long Island, right? But how does the Catholic Church feel that, and I'm going to use me, I die, and she's going to carry my ashes up to New York. I won't lose her. But, so she's got my ashes. Is that okay with the Catholic Church?
Yes, as long as it's in a dignified manner and your end result is being buried in a consecrated place. So you're fine. I've transported ashes myself. So yes, they have to get there somehow, right? So, but yeah, you're fine. All right, thanks, Robin.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Now, yes, ma'am.
So, and let's take the Catholic Church out of it, because we all know we should be buried in sacred ground. But all these other people, you can take their ashes and spread them. I thought that was illegal.
Okay. As far as scattering cremated remains, yes, we follow what the church's recommendations are, but there are folks out there that do other things with cremated remains and scattering. If you are able to get the property owner's permission to scatter on their property, you've got permission, you may proceed. I want you to tell me how you get permission from somebody in the ocean. How do you get permission from somebody on the Blue Ridge Parkway? How do you get permission to do on the 9th hole at your favorite golf course? Think about that. If you were to go to the end of the pier and scatter cremated remains in the ocean, you could be cited for littering. I've heard folks, there are agents out there that will take cremated remains out on a boat, go out a couple miles off the coast, scatter the cremated remains with the captain's permission. For health reasons, as far as cremated remains, you can touch them with a bare hand. They are clean. There may be some residue on your hand, but you won't catch anything from them because of the temperatures. And that is a whole nother seminar. But certainly we could probably talk to Natalie and have a seminar on cremation and removing the mystery of cremation, because there's a lot of rules and regulations that you don't know. And are you supposed to know them? No, that's my job. That's our crematory operator's job, is to know all the rules and regulations. But let me give you a brief example. Say, for example, you pass away here in South Carolina. You live in South Carolina, and you pass away at home. You're under hospice care, and you pass peacefully. We would come pick you up, bring you into our care. South Carolina requires, in order for us to conduct a cremation, that we obtain a coroner's permit. A coroner charges $25 for that permit. It's just a $25 permit fee, and that's what they charge. Again, that would fall under the cash advance items. But since you don't know where you're going to pass away, say, for example, you're at home and they carry you to the closest emergency room. Closest emergency room, if you live in Sun City, guess what? You're getting taken across the border into Mecklenburg County. Mecklenburg County, if you pass away in the emergency room, we have to get a couple documents. We have to get the death certificate from your doctor that's going to be willing to sign the document for the not the cremation, but the death certificate. we have to take your body to the medical examiner's office in Mecklenburg County. They charge a $50 examination fee, and there's a $125 transportation fee. So again, it depends on where you pass away, would depend on what type of permits we need. Say, for example, you're in Atrium Pineville or CMC Pineville, and you've been an inpatient for a couple days, or you've been admitted after an emergency room. Just admitted, period. You do not need to get a permit. You are inpatient. The only time we really have to get any type of certain extra documents in North Carolina is if you pass away in the emergency room, outpatient, or at your residence, not under a doctor's care in your home, which is hospice. So those are the different rules and regulations. So when someone says, you ask me how much does a cremation cost, I can say this, but God doesn't promise us a tomorrow here. So how are we going to know where we're going to pass away? So I can't really tell you what the exact charges are. So if someone had experienced the death and they call our funeral home and they ask questions, how much is it going to cost? We have to ask more questions because we want you to be aware of what all the rules are. But for us to help you, we've got to ask these questions. And it kind of seems unfair, but we have to, if you want me to help you, I have to ask some of those questions that are pretty sensitive. Where did he pass away? And some folks don't want to tell us that he passed away. Yeah, she said at the nearest bar, not me. I just repeated it. So we try to be sensitive. But an automatic medical examiner case, an automatic, where you can't even go to a funeral home first. Say, for example, you had a fall, something, a traumatic death, accident. Guess what? You're not going to a funeral home just yet. You're not going to the emergency room. They might take you to the emergency room if there's a possibility that your life may be saved. But after that, and if you don't survive, you will go to the medical examiner's office, and they may conduct an autopsy. That autopsy, how many of you are familiar with the term autopsy or know what it means? Okay. For those that don't, what they do is it's an internal examination. So the permit that I spoke of earlier, that coroner's permit, in order for us to conduct a cremation in South Carolina, they're not going through all that. They know that you passed away at home. There's someone there at the home, a hospice nurse. They don't have to do that in-depth exam. Mecklenburg County, that's the same thing. If you pass away and it's an accident or traumatic event, guess what? There's a possibility you may have to have an autopsy. And the louder that you scream that you don't want to have one really indicates that they're going to do it. So you can express your wishes to the medical examiner's office, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they will honor. Their job is to be the voice of the deceased and find out the truth. And that's part of what they have to do, and I would want answers if I was in that position.
Natalie, does the Catholic Church have any saying about autopsies?
Not to my knowledge.
No, okay, no.
And that's part of an examination. And if there's any type of a scientific where they have to send any samples out for biological examination, it is a minute part where they have to do. It may be a small portion of blood that they have to check for toxicology. But again, that's going to help determine the cause of death. Now, there's two different types of death certificates. There's one that has a cause of death on it, and then there's one that would say pending. A pending death certificate would go if we don't know what caused the death. It's a mystery, so we don't have answers. So those samples are sent to a lab. So I can speak from, let's say, medical examiner in Mecklenburg County. They send to Chapel Hill, and that process takes a while. But you have business. You need to get into your bank account. So they'll issue a death certificate with no cause of death on it. It would say pending. That way you can proceed with some of your affairs afterwards. Life insurance won't accept that because some policies pay a different fee or pay out differently versus an accident, natural. There's some cancer policies. They need to know what the actual cause of death was. So how long does it take before you get an answer? 6 months to 9 months. I know it seems like a very long time, but that's when we get the actual paper. Now, when those samples are sent off to a professional for this study, they talk back to the medical examiner's office. That medical examiner or whomever you're working with would call the family and say, this is what they found on those results. Once that medical examiner gives you the call, you can expect to see a hard copy paper 6 weeks later from the health department, and that's something that we would keep up with. We would keep checking with the health department vital records to see what the deal is, if it's been finalized. So we don't know, and we like to be able to give people answers, but that's beyond our control and our answers. Yes, ma'am.
You don't specifically ask for an autopsy, but they say it's necessary. Are you obligated to pay for it?
Oh, that is a good question. Okay, autopsies, are you paying for it or is the state paying for it? If you are involved in an accident, a car accident, or a mugging that went bad or you were hit by a car, the medical examiner's office will conduct the autopsy, and that's paid through different avenues, not through the family's expense. So the other end of the spectrum is, I want to know what it was that killed my dad. I want to know. You can pay to have an autopsy done. I promise you it is not cheap. There are different companies, agencies out there that conduct them. We work primarily through Piedmont down here at the hospital. They do conduct autopsies, and they do charge. It's roughly $3,000 to give you a ballpark idea of what that expense could be. So that is a personal choice, and will that change the outcome of the result or the diagnosis on the death certificate? I haven't seen any changes, but there might be just that one special case. We have folks that have different types of dementia and Alzheimer's, where once they pass away, the families want further study to say, yes, did he have Alzheimer's or no? The only way to determine that is through autopsy. And past medical history does dictate, as far as someone's cause of death or an immediate cause. And I'm not a doctor, but I can only speak from my past experiences working with doctors and seeing all the death certificates. If someone was going to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery in a casket, there's all kinds of verification processes that you have to go through, even when you're having your cremated remains inurned at the cemetery as well. They have to verify the veteran. They have to make sure the military discharge, the DD-214. For those that are veterans, when you meet with your funeral director, take your DD-214 with you, because that document, half the time kids can't find it. They don't know where you put it. You put it in such a safe place, it's never going to be found again. But as far as the waiting period for Arlington National for casketed remains, we had to wait 3 months to send someone home for burial there. And we have refrigeration. I know that sounds awful, but we have to keep them in a safe, respectful area, and mind the word respectful area is where we would keep those remains until the time that we actually send them.
And when I asked about after he was cremated, I said, well, what happens to the casket? And they said, oh, we bury it. And I'm like, what, $4,000 or whatever money it was casket? You're not going to rip out the lining and reuse it?
Well, let me explain about the use of a rental casket. There are rules. No, the casket that you purchased, a funeral home's not allowed to resell that casket. We've had families where they wanted a traditional type of a cremation, but they did not like a wooden casket. They liked a metal casket. And what we did was the family purchased that metal casket. The individual had their ceremonies, and when it came time for the cremation, we removed those remains from that casket and cremated the individual, because we cannot cremate a metal casket. And we asked the families, do you want us to donate it to an indigent family? And what we've done in the past is we would store that casket. if we come across a family that just simply doesn't have it. And what we do is we disclose to them. We tell them that this was previously occupied, but the family donated it to a family who may be able to use it. Therefore, that casket was reused. We don't sell it. We're not allowed to, but you know what? We've done a good thing. We might have hung on to that casket for a couple months, but something good come out of that. The family that needed it got it. And I know that we're running pretty late, and you guys have been here a really long time all day. And you're welcome to give me a call. I have a sheet in the back for you to sign up if you would like for me to follow up with you. I promise I am not a pressure person, but I will do what you ask me to. And we thank the church. Thank you. Thank you. We thank Natalie and the church and Father Kirby for giving us this opportunity to educate you. Thank you.
All right, everyone, I just wanted to close. Thank you all for being here. We hope that we provided you with a lot of great information. Certainly couldn't cover everything today, but please know you just have a team of people that are here ready to help. So we're honored to be those people. So if you need anything, I can be your point of contact and help you get to the right people. So with that, have a blessed weekend, and thank you for being here.